I signed up at 1:15. So what happened?
Oh, I don't know. I saw the link on there ahead of time.
I just went to Meetup. If you just go to Meetup, it should show everything you signed up for. And you just click on this one is Myth and Logos, and it takes you right to it.
Yeah, that's how I got in.
All right. Well, I got here. Thank you, David.
Hi, Sharon.
Sharon, I had that happen to me once. Just no link. And I emailed David and he sent me the link. I don't know if it's browser history not getting flushed or some update not being noticed or what, but
whatever it is, I'm here and I'm happy because I want to hear what you all say about this. I have an opinion, so I want to hear what everybody has to
say. My experience with coming to this meeting is that I think it's programming a just-in-time schedule.
It's a what?
Just-in-time schedule. Like a minute before it starts, you're notified.
Ping. Yep. That's how we do them at work too. And we used to put up invites far in advance, but we found that we were getting endless complaints from people trying to sign in an hour ahead, a day ahead, and they're like, how come this call isn't started? It's like, because you're an hour early and it hasn't begun yet. And they all go, oh, well, okay. So we start doing the same thing that David does, which is we just post it shortly before when somebody can actually be there to let them on so that they don't complain about the link not working.
Okay.
But just in time is a very much of a capitalist meme to get you into spending more money, how the mechanism of production works. So are you saying you're copying super capitalism?
Yeah, I'm really raking you guys over the coals for your money. I'm making so much money doing this.
Well, Phil, in my experience, just-in-time inventory always turned out to be more costly. Because in my business, when you need it, you didn't have it, and you have to use what you have, and it didn't work, then you have to get what you really needed.
Yeah.
So it was always better off to stock your inventory. Yes. So you can decide what you needed. That was my experience. Maybe the engineer, Donald, will tell us differently.
I know nothing of logistics. I don't.
No. It seems to me just in time also has to coordinate with how the product is delivered. For instance, there was a story that the Japanese had something ordered from an American company, and it turned out that there was like 4 missing. And they said, well, what happened to the 4? And it was explained, well, that's accounted by the percentage of breakage. We take that into account. And the Japanese got very upset, like, oh, we want 100%, not 96%.
Yes.
So do we have any tennis fans here, or am I the only fan?
I'm sort of semi, not really, but semi. Yeah.
Okay, well, the French Open is being played, and it's the Grand Slam. It's one of the 4 Grand Slam tournaments for the year. And there's a little girl from Florida. Her name is Coco Gauff, and she made it into the quarters, and she's 17 years old. Wow. And I am very excited. She lives up the road from me.
Oh, really?
And
where do you live?
I live in South Florida, Coral Springs, and Coco lives in Delray Beach.
Wow.
So that's really very good. Of course, she's African American, so she's got even a bigger plus. I mean, I don't.
Well, it'd be impressive if you can get her to join our group.
Hey, Joseph.
She lives up the road,
Howdy, neighbor.
I've watched her grow up, and I feel, of course, Venus and Serena Williams set the prototype for everybody. It's a dad and his daughter, and they are doing very well.
Well, there's an African American woman who's a gymnast.
Simone Biles.
I know,
Simone
like
Biles.
she is actually fantastic. I've never seen anything like it. So
Simone
like,
Biles.
I know, yeah, that's right.
Anyone who hasn't seen her, record-breaking vault should Google Simone Biles vault 2021, because she just did a move that no woman has ever done in acrobatics in the history of the
Yes,
sport.
I saw that. I saw that. I
And
like her a lot too.
It looks
Yes.
so simple, but only because she's so good.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
anybody else trying it would make it look incredibly complicated and difficult because they couldn't pull it off. But
But to show you how fast gymnastics has progressed, when I was in high school, I was not a very good gymnast, but I was in the gymnastics
You
team.
tried it?
No, I wasn't, but I was very bad at it. We had a bad coach as well. We went to a meeting where we saw the boy wanderer tumbling. He was the first one to ever did a double backflip. That would be in 1975, 1965 or 64, something like that. And then when I taught later on, I was teaching at Indiana State, and I went to watch one of the a women's meet, and every woman was doing a double backflip. I said, "My God!" I mean, like, in a matter of like, was it 10, 15 years?
right.
Like everybody was doing. I mean, it's like you couldn't even get on the team if you didn't do it. So it really progressed really fast. It was unbelievable.
I think part of what I love about Olympic sports and other kind of master level athletics is the way that they make visible and tangible for people the pursuit of excellence and the idea of what's possible. When you look at an infant in the crib, you can't see what Simone Biles just pulled off, but it was there when she was an infant in the crib, even though nobody could see it. And who knows what else is there, right? And it's the same in every other direction, master violin makers, or people who lead medical teams, Sharon.
Yes.
or,
Yes.
there's all this potential, and that the potential may not be literally infinite, but in terms of our ability to see it and measure it and characterize it, it's effectively infinite. It goes beyond our ability to specify it. And we don't, there's this, as Kenneth Smith likes to say, in the things that we think we understand and are measuring, there is this enormous, maybe infinite bonus of mystery of the things that just simply can't be measured yet, but are going to unfold over time. And some of them will become measurable later, but they were always waiting to come out. I bring this up because this issue of kind of this idea that, we're seeds, that we're the acorns that are going to become the tree. And the impulse to become the tree is in us already, even if you can't see it. And that's what makes us a seed. This idea of we only become what we already are, that we're always in the process of othering, of transforming into something new. This is core to the Greek concept of teleology, which is alluded to very quickly
Yes.
in the first paragraph of the essay. He gets right to it when he talks about Aristotle and the teeth. And what's interesting about the example of Aristotle and the teeth is if you Google Aristotle and teeth, all you'll see page after page for a while is everybody going, haha, Aristotle was wrong because he thought women had fewer teeth than men. And having established that Aristotle's wrong, they then move on. They're done. And so they completely missed the core point of what Aristotle had to say about teeth, which is what Kenneth is alluding to here, which is that teeth are teleological. There's whatever the role of accident and coincidence is in evolution, there's no way to conclude that teeth have no purpose. I mean, they obviously have a purpose. And so they raise paradoxical questions about how can it be that evolutionary processes, which seemingly involve an enormous amount of randomness, just huge amounts of coincidence and randomness, nevertheless can proceed as though they have a direction in order to not necessarily produce a fixed endpoint, but in order to, shall we say, converge upon solutions to common problems, right? Like the dolphin and the ichthyosaurus and the and so on. where the same body type is arrived at because the same forces are upon them. There is this subtle, difficult to measure while it's happening, but easy to measure when it's done quality that these sort of teleologically generated products of our body have, right? Before the tooth evolves, you can't see that it's coming. But after it evolves everywhere, and everybody's got them, just about. And if they don't have them, they have a substitute for them, like a beak. Or they have an entirely wildly different lifestyle. And so he's trying to, right off the bat in this opening paragraph, he's trying to wrestle with this issue of the incredibly important arche of the cosmos, the qualities of reality that produce measurable things through unmeasurable processes. This paradox of teleology, that we can't seem to characterize it while it's happening, but once it has produced something, you can see it and tell by its character that there must have been teleological processes at work. This paradox of teleology, is there purpose, is there not purpose, or is it both at the same time, is what Aristotle's talking about in his book on the parts of the animals, which is where he discusses teeth in the sense that Kenneth means it here. Phil, go ahead. I see you have your hand.
Yeah, I want to say something in that regard because I kind of agree and both disagree.
Perfect.
I had an interesting thought that went in a series of thoughts recently. I mean, actually just a couple of days ago. And I thought of the myth of Sisyphus, right? He's pushing the stone up the hill. And then when I was doing that, the struggle to push the stone up the hill is the purpose. And then I thought, well, really, I think the Zen patriarch, I don't know whether it's the 6 or the 7, said, well, there is no hill. There is no rock. Why is Sisyphus pushing the rock that isn't there up the hill that isn't there? So that's an interesting answer in a way. Interesting answer. Then I thought of, no, there's Beethoven. Now, I happen to think that Beethoven was the quintessential, the most important person in the 19th century. That's a lot to say when there's a whole lot of other people, right? And what he did was, I think, very, very interesting because he was talking about the human spirit, more than just the Ninth Symphony and freedom and all that, whatever. It's like, if you look at what happened at that period when the Christianity, God, which is pulling you toward the destiny, I suppose, if God was waning, then it was up to the human spirit to take over and push the rock up the hill, right? And that was a thing. It wasn't any concerto or any symphony he wrote, although they were beautiful, but the fact that he captured the spirit of the 19th century, that we have to put in the effort to do this because we are. And there's a wonderful painting. Well, I wouldn't say wonderful painting in the sense of it being a good painting, but I mean, it really captured this. There was a painting of Franz Liszt playing endless melodies to the bust of Beethoven. And in the audience was Victor Hugo watching. There was just a kind of like a little gathering. Bernini, Paganini, and George Sands was one of the women. And then there was 2 other women. One of them, I presume it could be Clara Schumann, but the other one, I don't know. I'm the one about Clara Schumann, I'm just speculating. So they were, of course, watching Liszt playing endless melodies to Beethoven, as if Beethoven's a demigod, right? It's like capture the spirit of this push up the hill, and which then led me to the story. You see, I'm an artist, so I have an eye for these things. To the moment when Vladimir Tatlin went to Picasso's studio, and he saw the synthetic cubism in which Picasso was putting together the collage to make the appearance of a guitar, even though it was made of cut paper that in some ways had nothing to do with a guitar, although it did have some curves that suggest a guitar. And Tatlin did not complain to him, but Tatlin went and saw immediately the problem that Picasso was engaged in. He was still concerned with the image of representation. And I think he might have coined it, but it might be later it was coined. He was concerned with the object matter rather than the subject matter. He said the real subject matter is man's creative force to transform something into something else. So now I don't know whether that's a teleology. I'm thinking more of it's a push into the future rather than just like, well, you're going to follow the inevitable, flow of the river downstream. So we're at the same point, and I'm thinking, that's an interesting thing. And then I thought of this, and I'll add this to it as a kind of addendum, because I might have told this story before. I think 2 days ago, I was in a meeting, and this guy was decent, but we finally came to a kind of argument. I said, look, there's so much I agree with you, but I have the suspicion that the exclusion of the middle is wrong, and that there is a middle. And I told him that not only we don't have to talk about the double slit experiment or Heisenberg's theory of uncertainty. I mean, we just have to think about multi-factor logic, right? That human beings are forced to make not either A or B, that's it. But there are so many A's and B's and A's and B's and A's and B that is compiled together that you have to mix that into multi-factor logic to say you finally come to a decision that maybe the micro level, each one is an A and B, but when you compile together, it's a completely different decision. And I didn't tell this story, but I realized the story I told about my nephews, my niece and nephews. I took them when they were young to Tijuana because they were forbidden by their parents for me to go take them to Tijuana. And I kind of solved the problem by bringing 2 binoculars to them, and so they could look at Tijuana.
You told us last week.
I know, but I want to end with this statement, is that in some sense, that was breaking the middle, because now they could say to the parent, did you go to Tijuana? No, we didn't go to Tijuana, right? And then if I ask them, now come on, did you really go to Tijuana? Yes, we went to Tijuana. The fact that they got to, in a sense, witness the forbidden city without going to the forbidden city was wonderful. That is actually breaking the A and B category, because there's something in between in which they did. So I kind of think that exclusion in the middle it's a useful but a false logic to a certain degree. So that's a series of things I went through to get to this answer that I think that agrees with you, that in some sense, at least that I told the guy, the reason why we disagree is that in the limits of understanding, not within understanding, but the limits of understanding, because and you would think that I'm going beyond the elastic limits of that limit. And I say, no, it's not beyond the elastic limits of human understanding. So that was my question back to you, I guess.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's where it gets interesting is, when we see the defects of the law of the excluded middle, when we see that it creates a too simplified black and white world, and that much of the truth is not at one end or the other. Our first impulse is to look for compromises, some of each. But what we discover is that the world isn't gray, it's full of color. And that color is, on the one hand, between black and white, and on the other hand, it's not between black and white. It's like another dimension. that can project down into gray, but it's actually above it in another space that neither black nor white can conceive of. It's there, you know, it's outside the frame of the discussion. And in the same way, one of the signs that you're sniffing around archai and principles and the other deep things of their nunft that Aristoi are concerned with is that you start finding topics that cannot be simplified as being either true or false. That if either one that you say is wrong, but it's also partly right, because the truth is a kind of paradox, like you're describing, where it's occupying multiple dimensions at the same time. The way that the principle of life operates at the same time in every living cell in the universe, which is an infinite from our perspective, that's an infinity. But it's also operating differently in every single cell, so that every single cell is not just stamped out and duplicating what the others are doing, but instead they're adapting to their circumstances. That means infinite diversity at the same time that you've got that first infinity. And then the third layer of infinity, that each of them is also transforming itself and unfolding new order according to its own teleology, is the third infinity. And it's this triple infinity dimension blows away any simple schema for trying to reduce archai down to true or false. It's too big, it's too multifaceted, and all the facets matter at the same time. And so you end up with paradox, just like you're describing. Part of what's fabulous about Beethoven as a virtuoso example for people is the way that as his hearing got worse, his music got even more profound and revolutionary. And as an example of pushing that damn boulder up that damn hill, Beethoven really was a wonder. It's Stupor Mundi, right? The whole world is like, oh my God, is this within the realm of human possibility? Could we even do this, maybe? Which we would have thought couldn't happen. We would have thought entropy would drag people down inevitably in that circumstance, and there he is rising. It gives us all hope. That's why I love your description of that painting. It's all the people in the audience inspired by the guy on the stage who's inspired by Beethoven. It's the waves of impact, right, of the example. It goes to the classical Greek concept of the virtuoso, who's necessary to make concrete and tangible and in story form the nature of the heuristic struggle, so that the rest of us can understand it and follow the example. So thank you for that. Sharon and then Donald.
So I have a pretty basic comment, nothing as sophisticated as Phil. And so I read the essay for this week, All of Life is Politics. And when I was finished, I had one comment, and I don't know if it is my lack of insight. The question I asked myself is, where's the beef? We were talking about mythos and logos, and I like the definition that he starts out with of politics as who gets what, when, and why. And so politics involves everything. I mean, us sitting in this group here is political. It's our families, it's our friends, it's government, it's everything. And so it's a little disappointed that the essay didn't go along the same vein of culture and anti-culture, and so we could see how politics fit into it. So that's what I end up asking myself, where's the beef? I couldn't quite connect it all together. In fact, I think there is one sentence here that I thought just applied to what we were talking about, where he says, in truth, not everyone gains something in acuity or self-subtlety every day that they live. They're always living and thinking that indisputable cause people to lose ground, to mistake vices for virtues, hence the absurdity of calling dolia or panacea forms of culture when they're actually kinds of disculture. And I wanted more of an expansion of that. Instead, he spoke a lot about, he spent paragraphs talking about his grandchildren and the way they interacted with each other. And that was not informative for me.
Yeah. Yeah, this is this essay is in many ways a sequel to the first one in this book, that talks about let's see, the title of the first one, Daughters and Granddaughters. And that was the one that gives us the example of the infant so that we can see begriff in its purest form. And what does it mean to be 100% gnosically and 0% noetically connected to the world, where you experience everything immediately with no filtering, and you're a live wire, and you can't predict the future or try to control things. You can only respond to them and be plugged into them. And so that's why he had that as that's why David selected that as the first essay to go into this book to talk about mythos and logos, because to understand mythos culture, we have to get an understanding of first of begriff and then of gnosis, which begriff gives us an example of, in order to be able to project our way upwards to Vernunft and the kind of level at which Aristoi try to think, and at which they have to generate culture so that there can be culture. So in this essay, another one that David selected in our sequence, the purpose is to come back around again to the opening essay, and to see it in light of the previous essays, and to say, what is the nature of not just of the infant's experience, but of the mother's experience gestating what's going to become new life, and what is the relationships. He talks about the relationships between the children, where the one who is older and wiser takes the younger one under their wing and tries to learn how do you get them to understand the things that they don't understand yet? How do you help them unfold the new capacity for insight that's inside them but hasn't yet developed, in order to help them see the larger world and connect themselves into and grow into it and become more sophisticated into it? So he's talking here about the process of anthropoculture. And anthropoculture, the cultivation of human character through the stages that Hegel identifies, from begriff through Verstand toward Vernunft, is the journey to generate mythos culture. For there to be mythos culture, there have to be people operating at the eristic Vernunft level, and they aren't born that way. It has to be drawn out of them. They have to, if they have the capacity to grow in that direction, it has to be cultivated. They can't do it by themselves. If somebody was born with the capacity to become an Aristos, but they live in an anti-culture that's constantly suppressing its development, they'll never become an Aristos. They'll always end up being some kind of distorted, unhappy Banausos or doulos, because they're trying to fit within a role that's cutting off their potential, and they can feel the ache of it, but they don't know what to do about it because they've got nothing to draw them out. So this is why he's doing the examples of the older children sort of adopting the younger children and starting to teach them the ways of the world and how to think and what the possibilities are. So go ahead.
So the behavior of the older children to the younger ones, that's the politics that he's talking about.
Yes. And just like this definition of culture he's using is completely different from a modern definition of culture, in the same way this definition of politics is completely different from a modern definition of politics.
Okay.
When he first cites that definition of politics at the beginning, the most important part is the parenthetical. And banausically, he says. It's not just that Harold Lasswell defines it pithily, but that he defines it banausically. So if you're a banausos, all you care about is who gets what, when, and why, with an eye towards how about yourself, and how do you get as much as you want to get, right? The banausic defect is the tendency to become a dragon and to want everything and to want to control everything. Because the ego is infinitely expansive in its desire to will things. The idea that there could be a whole other reason for politics, a more important reason, more profound, and that human civilization might actually depend upon it for its survival, is inexpressible within the Banausic framework. Verstand can't think these thoughts. Verstand can only deal with finite, measurable things. And how much money I have in my bank account is measurable. But cultivating human beings to help them unleash their potential to be better, in the hopes that you can generate enough heuristic people working on the vernunft problems to generate a culture that can make us all better. That's an infinitizing problem because it deals with archai. And because it's infinitizing, the Verstand can't measure it, doesn't understand it, doesn't consider it real, and therefore treats it as ceteris paribus, unimportant, pushed to the background. It gets that boulder gets pushed down the hill by Verstand and by the Banausoi, thinking that it's not the important part. Well, they put all their effort instead into trying to maximize profits or control or whatever the things are that they can measure. So what he's doing here is he's trying to show that civilizational issue that the archaic Greeks understood, but that we really don't understand. He's trying to illustrate it in the form of family dynamics within a single family. And so we'll talk about it more throughout the rest of this, but that's the general shape of this essay and kind of what it's doing here.
Well, that helps me a lot because that gives me a context, because I saw politics in a whole different realm, and I couldn't fit the fact that we had spent the last couple of weeks talking about the Greek evaluations of character, and then I came to this and I couldn't fit it in.
Right. Yeah, it's the problem we keep coming back to just about every week, that all of the words and concepts that we need to understand the archaic Greek perspective have been redefined under modernism to have not just different, but mutually exclusive definitions that prevent us from talking about the issues in the way the archaic Greeks would understand them. And as a result, that becomes a barrier between us and being able to add that worldview to our list of perspectives. And so we end up having to break down terminology like politics. We'll come back to this in a moment. We got a line, so I'm going to go to the line first. But one of the key things to keep track of is that politics is in the title and Aristotle's in the first paragraph. So there's no way today that we can get through this without talking about Aristotle's politics, which we will do in a bit, what he meant by it. So Donald, then Marianne, then Ginny. Go ahead, Donald.
Be quick, but there's so much here about arete, particularly in the Greek sense of fitness to purpose or excellence at doing something, but we don't know what these things are or might be until they're sort of revealed in history or in our actual living. No one knew whether Simone Biles could do this move, even a human could do it, until it's done. And that's very important to remember, that all of these Greek virtues reveal themselves this way. There's not some absolute standard. There's not a tablet somewhere that says these are the human virtues and this is what it takes to have them. We find out what these mean for ourselves through our history and our living and pursuing our teleology. The second, about midway down the page, on the second page of this, it looks like there's a 2-2. Pathetically want to believe or imagine. I can't read that sentence with 2 2s in it like that.
Yes, thank you.
I try. Sometimes it is me. And then when Kenneth talks about Gainia, and I sort of like that, because I don't know where he of course he uses his own family here, and that's kind of interesting. But the theme for the Greeks was always paideia, which we always say education, but it's really boy culture. It's the opposite of Gainia. It's paideia, it's for boys, because Greek culture depended on raising men. and so the raising of men became the general term for just education, culture, because that was the the transmissive media, I guess, of Greek culture. But going back to Gainia like this is a kind of an interesting move on Kenneth's part. But knowing his children, I would say they were raised by Angela and turned out perfectly fine.
Right. Right.
And if you try to have conversations with them about all this Hegelian Greek stuff or whatever, well, good luck. I don't think they're definitely very thoughtful, critically thinking individuals who are excellent in their various fields, but they're not Kenneth either.
Yeah, they're not little Kenneth clones, are they?
They're not little Kenneths. They are more. I find them more like Angela, but she is a more empathetic, understanding person in many ways. I don't know. It's hard to. I'm not criticizing any of them. I've enjoyed many times with them, but it is interesting that he did turn to the female side here, whereas you almost never read that in Greek history at all. There is nothing. I have a few books on women in Greek culture, our classic Greek culture and stuff, and they are the most just far-fetched suppositions on the least of evidence,
Yeah.
Because everybody says, oh, well, there's Sappho and there's this and well, yeah, that's one. You've got one. The rest were in the house, seldom left the house. It was sometimes I think it's a very different view in terms of, uncles, brothers, husbands, fathers dominated that culture by day. And as we talk, like that was a good thing, Phil. By fighting all the time, they generated jobs for themselves. They could It
was a great insight about the way that patriarchy makes itself necessary in order to oppose itself.
We go attack those guys. That'll give them work and us work.
Right. Yeah, patriarchy is kind of a scam, isn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Someone has to protect the women from us. We'll do that. Yeah, that was good. And what you're underscoring here. So let's work our way backwards from where you ended up. The Greek culture was not to be trying to understand the archaic Greek perspective, to try to practice the polyperspectivalism that's central to Kenneth Smithian philosophy. We're not saying that the archaic Greek perspective is the right one and we should abandon all others and follow it. This is not monotheism, right? This isn't totalitarianism. Polyperspectivalism requires that we actually understand different perspectives in their own terms, from according to their own value system and their own worldview, so that we gain the ability to modulate between alien worldviews. And if we don't have that ability to modulate between alien worldviews, then we're not actually a person. We're just a symptom of whichever worldview has us captured. And that's the state of being a modern. In the modern world, modernity has a very defined, precise Apollonian perspective on what counts as knowledge, what counts as values, what is the world, what is the role of a person, and so forth. And we marinate in that lifelong to the extent that we don't even understand how captured we are by it. And that means that whenever we try to learn these other perspectives, what we usually do is fail to see them in their own terms. And instead we translate them into our terms. And then we believe that we are representing those perspectives when actually we're representing, paper tigers, little puppet versions that are almost inevitably designed to look inferior to our own in order to justify our own being superior. So there's a circular argument built into the structure of the way that modernity looks at things. Everybody before us, for example, according to modernity, is primitive. They're all inferior. They're all worse than we are. We're better than all of them because they're less advanced. Yeah, and that idea that progress, i.e., progress towards us, is an improvement, is part of the catechism of modernity, and it prevents us from understanding what we're seeing. So there's a natural tendency, if when you're trying to break out of that pattern, when you're trying to get the ability to see the archaic Greek perspective for what it is, there is a tendency to slip from one totalitarianism into a second totalitarianism. You get these Hellenophiles who start saying, okay, it's modernity that sucks. Actually, it's the archaic Greek perspective that's perfect, and we should all believe that. And that's every bit as bad in its way. That's as bad as being totalitarian, fideistic towards modernity. That's not what we want at all. We want to see them each in their own terms. So if we're going to see them each in their own terms, we have to understand that what's important about the archaic Greek perspective is that the classical Greeks were writing about it while they were leaving it, while they were becoming classical Greeks. And then again, when they left behind the classical Hellenic stage of their development and moved on to the Hellenistic Alexandrian stage, again, they were writing about it. And so we saw a civilization document its move from a more Dionysian archaic style to a more Apollonian classical style to finally a more kind of epigonistic academicist collector style, right? And by doing that, by seeing the same people try to talk about three different perspectives that they passed through, we get a culture that is trying to develop a common language to be able to describe multiple perspectives. That's vanishingly rare in the history of humanity on Earth. Almost always people make these transitions and literacy doesn't arise until after they've already left behind and forgotten their archaic stage. And so they themselves are incapable of describing who they used to be in the kinds of ways that would be illuminating to us. But the Greeks were writing then. And so we're able to see these pictures. Now, based on these pictures, part of what we can see is, the archaic Greek perspective is not a perfect perspective. It's not something we're supposed to be becoming, but it's preserving even older things that otherwise would be lost in the darkness of prehistory entirely. So there are still traces of indigenous culture among the archaic Greeks. They're a colonizer culture, no doubt. I mean, they colonized, the Hellenic spaces, and they knew it, and they organized themselves according to it, and they remembered their tribes, and they had tribal heroes and all that. But at the same time, they had not been a colonizer culture for as long as later writers will have been. And as a result, they have not yet erased all of the value systems, all of the worldview, the form of their polytheism, for example, the fact that they want to add deities when they encounter new cultures instead of erasing the other cultures. That is a much older approach to things. So they're a colonizer culture, and that's a problem. And when you read them, you have to be able to separate the indigenous part of what they're writing from the colonizer part of what they're writing. The same is true for patriarchy. They are a very patriarchal culture. They were, women had enormous restrictions upon them, and men treated women as domestic slaves, basically, almost entirely. And there were women for whom that was not the case, who kind of found ways to squeeze out from those roles and emerge as people and as individuals and be heard and recorded in history. But they were definitely the exceptions, as you say. Like Sappho is an exception. She's not the norm by any means. And so as a result, when we're reading the archaic Greeks and we're trying to sift the wheat from the chaff, we also have to separate the patriarchy from the older matriarchy. Because you can see in the Greek myths, they remember their matriarchal origins. They have lots of goddesses, and they have very old myths in which the goddesses were in charge, and the gods came along later and, shoved them aside or married them and, took authority, but in many cases had to share authority because it was the only way they could be considered the king, as long as they married the queen. So examples of this are that, in fact, Aristotle screwed up when it came to knowing how many teeth are in a woman's mouth. And you think, how could he not know that women have the same number of teeth as men? How could he not know that? especially given that Aristotle's whole raison d'etre was criticizing Plato for being too idealistic and logical and rational. He was saying you have to look in the world and you have to look at the evidence of the world and use that to inform your logic and shape your logic. You can't do it the other way around. If you start with logic and then cherry pick the evidence that seems to support your logic, then you get stuck in a Platonic, Parmenidean Verstand trap. And Aristotle was opposed to that. And yet here he is, literally in writing, making exactly the same mistake about women's teeth and thinking that there's fewer of them, right? I mean, he's hoist on his own petard. He's exemplifying the very flaw that he himself stood against as a philosopher. But when you look at the structure of his culture, you can see why that flaw would have happened. Men and women were really isolated from each other. Women had their realm and men had their realm. Men took the realm of the entire world and everything in it except the household, right? Which they left to the women, and the women were stuck with this little space. And it shows you how segregated the Greeks were. You know, that no Greek man who was a philosopher ever sat down and counted a woman's teeth and went, that's the same number we have. You got to think about what is the structure of a society in which that just wouldn't come up, in which it just wouldn't happen. And then we have to take that into account when we're trying to understand the limits and liabilities of the Greek perspectives. But all that said, the point that you opened with when you're talking about arete and entelechy is right on the money. About there is an elusive quality. It's hard to pin down to these things that make culture and life possible. And we'll be coming back to that over and over throughout the course of today. So thank you for that, Donald. I think it's Marianne, then Ginny, then Dave, then Phil. So Marianne, go ahead.
Okay. So I just got back from being with a 4-year-old, and I had all these, in my imagination, I had all these play moves. I was going to play here, play there, but he turned out to be the boss of me. It was only what he wanted to play. And I understand it. I started to think about totalitarianism and spanking, and how really in the past, like I've been spanked, but I try not to spank my daughter, and my daughter is trying to do hug it out and try to get him regulated by human touch. And then I was thinking about the epigenetics factor in human violence, and being in war zones and being in areas where there's high stress will create cultures that are minimalized. And really one way of coping in a minimalized society is to become more like a 4-year-old child, where you want this, and if you can't have it, you're going to steal it, or you're going to take it from your neighbor. And so I wanted to say that our acceptance of the patriarchy also encouraged us to spank our kids and hit them really hard so we could get what we wanted right away. And to see my daughter and her family struggling to try to regulate a person, God, I hope it helps evolution. I hope it makes a difference, because it's hard work.
It is, isn't it? And you know, this goes to Donald's point about the way in this essay that Kenneth is having talked about paideia a lot, and he does. Here he's talking about Gainea and about, you know, the arts of women in Greek culture and the importance of them. You know, that in the Greek culture, children were entirely under the command of their mothers up until, I don't remember the age 10. There's some cutoff age where they're then introduced to the male world. If they're boys, then they're taken out of it and introduced to the male world. And in doing this, part of the implicit assumption among Greek men is that they don't know how to get a boy to that point. They know what to do with a boy once they're civilized up to a certain point. Then they can start commanding them and pushing them around and turning them into men. but they don't know how to get them from the begriff stage to the stage where they're trainable into being Greek men. It's a mystery to them. They know it has to be done, but they themselves don't know how to do it. And part of what Kenneth is doing here, he's not saying that women are only allowed to do what the Greeks under Gainea were doing, with what the Greek women were doing, but he's saying that it's interesting to look at this neglected part of Greek culture, this magical part that somehow transforms a 100% begriff infant into someone who has the capacity to start engaging in Verstand and other sorts of kind of more sophisticated activities. That the process of getting them there, and this is where we're looking really deep at this point. This is where tacitly Banausea and Verstand and the male colonizer culture are admitting that they would be incapable of cultivating human beings to the point that they're able to become, adult and politically activated. That there is another set of arts that they've been neglecting and that women haven't in Greek culture because of the extreme polarization of roles, without which it's just not possible to have adults. And whatever those arts are, those mysterious arts, they give it the name Gainea, and they say, well, those mysteries will happen in the household, and we will trust that out of the other end will come, proto-people who can become people. So part of what Kenneth's doing here is he's trying to pop the lid on that silent part of Greek culture and say, well, what if we're not silent about it? What are these arts by which we draw forth and help develop the potential? And one of the first rules is, well, you can't put them among the men when they're a child, because the man's going to try to beat them into submission the way he does his fellow peers and the soldiers and the little boys, and it won't work. That colonizer culture has a defect at its very core, which is that it can't reproduce itself. It has to exist atop a deeper, older layer that remembers and practices the art of drawing people out. And it's for the reason you just said, Marianne, because you can help them exercise their potential and unfold themselves into new possibilities, but you can't force them to do it. If you force them to do it, you get broken people, you get broken adults. That's and as I was a product of that process, I had lots and lots of therapy to help me work my way through the enormous problems that were caused in me by that process. So I'm well acquainted with the problems of it. It's a paradox. And so part of what he's hinting at here, and this goes to Sharon's point about, what is the connection between this intimate kind of domestic discussion he's got going on in here and the larger discussion we've been in about character types and culture and politics and civilizations. And the larger connection is, what would have happened to Greek culture if the men had just decided to take over the whole raising of children? It would have collapsed within a generation or two, because you just can't coerce infants into becoming what you want them to be. You just can't do it. You have to. Verstand is not enough. Ego is not enough. Designs and plans and strategies are not enough. You need gnosis. You need an enormous amount of receptivity and perceptiveness and responsiveness. You need not just praxis, not just acting, but pathos to suffer. You need to suffer the children in a sense where you let them be who they're becoming whenever it's safe for them to do that, so that they will unfold themselves. And that capacity, which the classical Greek men suppressed in themselves on their journey to be egotistical Verstand monsters, was what was necessary to recultivate, to create an Aristos. You can't have an Aristos who is all about ego and control and design and so forth. The Aristos has to bring in this, quote, classically Greek female Gainea realm of expertise to become a whole human being capable to see Archaic. Archaic, the infinitizing quality of nature that has the potential to give us guidance about truth, meaning, and right and wrong, has that same surprising, hidden, nested quality that an infant has, where it's full of things that are not obvious but that are important. And the only way to understand them is to let them unfold themselves as you interact with them so that you can learn about them. So that's what he's talking about here. He's using the example of the raising of the children and how that, what works and what doesn't work, to help us kind of start to understand what it's like to be Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill. If you're going to try to engage with Archaic, you've got to do it the way that you engage with an infant. You don't have complete control over the situation, and and the difference is that the infant is helpless, and so you have to be tender with the infant just because it's the only way. But the Archai are not helpless. They're effectively gods by comparison with us. They have, when Kafka says in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world, he's talking about Archai. Entropy and the life will find a way, like from Jurassic Park, and tragedy, and all of these deep patterns that we see, they rule over us. But we can't demand that they tell us how they work any more than we can demand an infant tell us how it works, even though, the relationship that we have to have with them is from a position in which, So there's paradoxes here, right? Who's the infant? Who's the child? Who's in charge and who's not in charge? How do you relate to it? Do you have control or do you not have control? This whole area is rife with paradoxes that just keep manifesting as our finite, limited human mind attempts to represent infinitizing things around us and come up with a way to live together. So thank you for bringing that up, Marianne. It's profound. I think it's Dave and then Phil and then Sharon. Go ahead, Dave.
Hey, you guys. Hello, everyone. Nice to see everyone. I have a different take on the essay. I didn't have too much really to respond to, but I think on the top of page 84, I'll just refer us to the text. That really distills it for me. I saw the essay as a contradistinction between children and adults. And as he says here on the top of page 84, in so many cases, the infant's instincts outwit the parent's conscious intellect. And that's because as moderns, as we grow up and become adults, we become acculturated by the market and by other forces. And that really sort of stupefies us. And later on in the same paragraph, he refers to political or perspectival superiority. I think that's important. And that is really just the ability to see what is actually what. So you're more in touch with the reality of the situation there. And I think, celebrating the instincts of the child in contrast to modern adults, you see that we tend to lose touch with the world as it really is. And instead we engage with these banal-sick narratives in our own mind. And that's what I really saw the essay doing. I didn't have quite the same read as many of you so far. And I just wanted to draw our attention to one more sentence on page 87, the last sentence of the first paragraph. We've talked in this group several times about this idea of going along to get along. And I think here, Kenneth Smith really has some creative language. I really like the words he uses to describe that mindset, calling it the wisdom of slaves, that life will go so much smoother if only they can learn how to capitulate properly to those with the power to make them happy and prosperous. So that he's certainly coming down against that drive. And that's all I have for this week. Then I'd put myself on mute.
The reference to Donald. Running jokes. All right, so that's good stuff. Let's talk about it, because the wisdom of slaves is a recurring theme. Capitulation to power is a recurring theme. It is natural to assume that powerful people define our circumstances completely. and that if we do what they want, then they pay us and they treat us better, and that's as good. That's what we should be adapting to. We should be adapting to the world as it is, where the world as it is defined as what powerful people want from us. Almost everybody under modernism slips into that, and enormous numbers of people under medievalism slipped under it. It's a long-standing thing for people to do. But what it confuses is it confuses the difference between what powerful people want and what's actually true. Because as Nietzsche tells us, power makes stupid. The worst people in the world to be adapting to is the powerful, because their power makes them blind to the natural circumstances around them. They create illusions of being in control that create massive repercussions, destructive repercussions, that they themselves are insulated from by their own power, at least for a while, until things catch up with them. And the more people they can succor to go along with them in their mistakes, the greater the calamity that's being generated by great masses of people all doing the wrong thing together because they think that the powerful person represents nature itself. There's a way in which worshiping people who have power and wanting to please them is a form of kind of projected hubris. It's like, okay, maybe I don't get to impose my ego on the world, but I can still worship ego if it's somebody else's ego. That still proves that human ego is a god and deserves to be, treated as an authoritative force in the cosmos, when the archaic Greeks knew it wasn't. Well, and they're, the mortal realm and the realm of archaic powers and principles are completely different from each other. All mortal things are finite. All powers and principles are infinite. And to mistake the two for each other is a massive category mistake. It's like thinking a human being is a planet, and thinking that's reasonable, or a universe. But we create these social relationships in which that mistake not only is possible, but is inevitable, and most people fall for it. So it's really important, as part of trying to develop ourselves to have artistic potential, that we create some very clear examples for ourselves of how it is not in fact true that the world created by powerful people is synonymous with the true authority of the natural world. So I'm glad, Dave, you brought our attention to the wisdom of slaves quote. The other one that you started out with, let me just back up my way to it here. Yes, political or perspectival superiority. One of the issues I struggled with for a long time with Kenneth was he takes for granted the archaic Greek idea that nature is not egalitarian. Nature is hierarchical. We are not, in fact, all equal. The reason that we should respect one another and look out for one another and try to give each other, equal potential to develop as much as we can is not because we're identical. The argument that only if we're equal do we all deserve to be treated with dignity is baked right into the way that we've structured the civil rights movement under modernism. And although it's hard for us to see it, it's just another form of totalitarianism. It's just saying we shouldn't oppress each other because we're identical, but if we can find somebody inferior to us, then we can oppress them. That's what's hidden inside of the idea that we all deserve rights because we're all equal to each other. Right? And so it's why it's possible for a movement like this can be structured in such a way that we treat other people equally, but we treat the nature like crap because we think it's inferior to us under the modernist schema in which nature is below humanity. The idea that things deserve to be treated right, not because they're identical, but because even in their differentiation, they are still worthy. In fact, maybe even more worthy. Maybe the platypus, for being rare and unusual, even if it's weak, is special and deserves to be singled out for protection. Maybe we don't treat everybody the same. Maybe, for example, we look at who's been marginalized the most so that we can start there. Maybe if several houses are on fire, we say, well, which one is worst off right now? or which one can be saved, can we save more? The ability to discriminate, not cruelly or out of bigotry, but out of actual value-driven taste, to figure out where the priorities are, only makes sense if we understand that the world is organized hierarchically. In a healthy relationship, parents know more than infants do. And it would be a category mistake to treat them as identical or equivalent. So we have to be able to make distinctions. We have to be able to recognize and respect differentiations in expertise, in ethics, in athletic ability, like in Simone Biles or Surya Bonali. We have to be able to see that we have to be able to see and recognize the importance of the hierarchies, the natural, not the artificial hierarchies, but the natural hierarchies within us, at the same time that we don't use those hierarchies as excuses to engage in colonization or bullying or patriarchy or other forms of oppression. This is kind of where we really have to go, right? Because as long as we can only treat each other with justice, so long as we think that other people are our equals, we're going to be cruel to children. We're going to be cruel to animals. We're going to, we're going to have this. We're going to be still carrying this colonizer culture forward in us, just kind of changing who our targets are. So Kenneth Smith talks about a world in the Archaic Greeks, a world in which things can be hierarchically differentiated from each other and need to be organized according to those hierarchies, but for the good of all, not for the good of the few at the expense of the all. And as moderns, our hackles go up, and we're like, okay, but this is where the exploiters are going to go, right? They're going to claim that they're the ones in charge, and they're going to claim that they're exploiting everybody for the good of all. And it's true, that's what they do, right? We see it around us every day. People are saying, "Oh, I'm just as good as you're just as good as I am, and that's why you should give me all your money." There's all these weird spinning around political arguments that are used to chain people up into artificial hierarchies while claiming to be serving the good of the whole. And it's to such a point that it's hard for us to believe it's possible for there to be a focus on the good of the whole if we admit that people are different from each other and that there are natural hierarchies. But part of what Kenneth Smith is saying is that as not an escapist philosopher, but as an existentialist philosopher, regardless of the fact that people abuse this truth and lie about it and mimic it and manipulate it, nevertheless, to be existentialists, we have to admit that it is, in fact, the condition we live in, that we are not all equally capable. And that therefore, to quote Marvel Comics, with great power comes great responsibility. That the way that society should be organized is that the people who have greater capacity in some particular area should become mentors for the people who have less capacity in that area, mimicking the parent-child relationship in its healthiest form, which is what this entire essay is about. What we see the older child do with the younger child is the duty of the Aristoi. It's why Aristoi, in engaging in Vernunft, very quickly have to turn to being culture generators. They have to help make things better because they're the only ones thinking at a Vernunft level, and therefore they're the only ones able to see the deep systemic problems that are in the current status quo that need to be overcome. Other people can see the symptoms of those deep systemic problems, but their attempts to solve them are going to be too finite and focused on the symptoms and allow the main problem to continue or even get worse. It's only people who can think at a Vernunft level, who cultivate that in themselves, who are going to be able to see how all the pieces connect together and where the root of the problem is in order to address it. And if they don't do that, then it isn't being done, and the culture is senescing and falling apart. Like we see under modernism, where Aristoi are suppressed and Vernunft is suppressed and everything is put in the hands of the Banausoi. So what Dave pointed out here when he talks about political or perspectival superiority, form or masterliness, is not a function of age or social acuity. He's talking about this is talking about the mission of Aristoi, the purpose of Vernunft, why it evolved in us as a species. Like, why did teeth evolve is a similar question to why Vernunft evolved. Other species may not need Vernunft. but Homo sapiens is cognitively structured in such a way that we have to have some people with Vernunft helping to get us pointed back in the right direction. So once again, Dave, great job. You really pointed us right at it there. Thank you. I think it's Phil and then Sharon, then Donald, then Joseph, if I remember correctly. So yeah. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if the problem doesn't lie in the problem of presence and absence. What I'm thinking of, but when we talk about Greek culture, we pretty much collapse it into Athens, really, right? I mean, we have pretty much, except for the experts in Greek history, we pretty much have forgotten about anything else. Well, we maybe remember slightly Sparta. That's about it. And so in a sense, all the other representations are silent and absent. And therefore we have stereotyped all Greeks into Athenians, and classical Athenians as such. And the same thing goes on this level. I was thinking, I'm not a historian, so I can't speak with authority, but as little as I know, the situation in Sparta was very different from Athens. In fact, in Sparta, the women have more power than you would imagine, because the professional army was always on the march, so to speak. And so the city was kind of left to the women running it. I mean, there was two kings, actually. One king was still at home, but the women was pretty much have their own society for at least a certain period of time. And they had actually a lot of power, and particularly a lot of power in the market. And so in some sense, perhaps that story should be told. I mean, I myself have always thought, well, I wouldn't want to live in Sparta, but on different levels, Sparta actually had something that's maybe more archaic in that sense. And so I think the same thing is what you mentioned about a child being brought up, in Sparta, the women had total control up to, I think, the age of 7, and then they're given to the men to be practiced. Of course, the men were immediately extremely brutal. Those that can't make it are thrown into a pit or a cave or something, and left to survive on their own. Of course, they don't mostly. So that was infanticide, certainly for a sense. So only the tough and the one that could handle warfare was. So it must have been a very difficult transition for the boys. The girls didn't have that transition. I don't know if they learned dance or whatever they learned, but the boys, like on the one moment, you're mama's boy, and then the next moment you're throwing in the pit. I mean, it's like, talk about shock therapy. I mean, you can't make that shock. I think that wasn't the case in Athens because the men was around all the time. And so except for the comedians did give women a role in the sense of making fun of the men controlling things. But in some sense, so in that sense, we then have this portrait of, ancient Greeks or classical Greek as actually very patriarchal, which it is, and so is all of Greece, but less so in maybe some of the other cities that we don't know about, And I think that we should expand that. And I wonder whether that itself is not just a filtering. I don't know how intentional it is or whether what it is, but that silence is also the silence that we see in terms of a colonial culture that, in a sense, well, first, I guess, if you have your ratters and you could, maybe you kill as many as you could, and then then you silence the rest of them by putting them into, like re-education camps, the Indian camps. So they stripped away their culture. So once again, shock therapy. You wonder why a lot of them, even if I was pointing out to another group that even if you didn't kill them, in the long run, you did kill them spiritually because they were disconnected from whatever origins they had, and they had to like be in shock therapy to learn a whole new different culture, even if that was well intended. And I'm not sure if it was well intended, but even if it was. So in that sense, I think the fact that we are able to make absent something so easily, and that, you know, we have in a way not allowed them to be present, I kind of think that that's the case. Now, women are nowadays making their presence known a lot more, right? They have presented themselves. So almost in some sense, it's even beyond an intellectual thing. You have to like show yourself and assert yourself to a certain degree to make sure that you're present in the market, you're present in the bureaucracy, you're present everywhere, and so forth. In a sense, for people to even notice you, let alone give you power. So I think that might be Venant that has a trick of playing this absence and presence game by eliminating something or downplaying it so it disappears. So part of the thing is to figure out a way to uncover the hiddenness, which is hidden away from us, that we forget about because why worry about it, because it's invisible, right? And I think one of the things that I was tremendously impressed by the Blacks is, you know, I had a chance of teaching in Oberlin to get to know a few of them, and it's like I was amazed when what's that poet's name? I should know her, but anyway, she came to and gave a birthday party to Odetta, and when I met that, it just seemed like they were a tight-knit group because they knew they had to protect each other. In fact, I asked a strange question about this poet. I said, when I taught Indiana State, I ran into a very strange situation, you know. There was going to be a movie shown of Malcolm X, and there was quite a few Black students in Indiana State. And I said, you know, I advised everybody, but particularly you should go to it. And I was surprised that so many did not even know. We're talking about Black students, about Malcolm X. So I asked her, like, why has Malcolm X in, let's say, 20 years been forgotten, kind of, even by the Blacks? And she said, well, you know, I think what happened was that the Black community decided they have to present Martin Luther King, and they didn't want to divide the attention so much. And so they didn't present him as much as they should have. And she admitted that. And that in that lack of presentation, in order to focus attention on something, then in a sense, he was absent. So I was actually shocked. You know, I thought for sure, like, oh, wow, Malcolm X, we should all go see it. Like, no, now maybe I could expect it from the white students, but the Black students, like who? I mean, like, wow, yeah, like you do. I wasn't going to try to explain it to them because, like, I didn't want to insult them. Like, oh, you should know about Malcolm X. So, in some sense, I think presence is very important, and the fact that presence, by presenting Martin Luther King's story, presenting his work, we got a holiday, right? We might not have got a holiday if we sort of diverted our attention on all the people that should be known, that has been sort of hidden away. Now, Malcolm X is coming back to a certain degree, but I think presence is really, very important. And that's why, you know, I was so happy. In fact, I asked my niece, who's an environmentalist, you know, I said, what about this woman who's been appointed the director or the head of the natural resources or whatever?
Interior, Deb Holland.
And yeah, because I was very happy, but I was also wanted to hear, like, she in fact is not just a figurehead, but No, she said she's very good at that. She knows that stuff. So that was very good. The fact that after all these years, we finally have one cabinet member that is American Indian. I mean that is presence, not just in terms of ideas, like you're physically shown that you're there. Okay, so I think presence is important. That's all I'm saying. Uncovering the invisible to make present the visible.
Well, that's profound. There's like a whole session or two we could do just about that about that topic. There's so much to be said on it, and I'm just gonna chicken out and say thanks, Phil. That was great. You're absolutely right. I think that both in the general thing, you know, you'll see this in liberation movements. That's why there's Pride Month, is people can have the most stupid prejudices about people if they never actually meet any of them. But if you see them over and over, then the concrete reality of the people begins to displace the artificiality of the bigoted caricatures of them. And it's part of why that's so important. But as far as the Greeks, I think your point is well taken that we overgeneralize about Athens. And part of what's interesting about the ancient structure is that it's pre-imperial. It's pre-nationhood. There was no concept of a unified nation, and that each city-state was its own city-state. And as a result, they're really quite different from each other. They have their own divinities even, let alone their own customs and their changes in economy and politics and so forth. And you see that some between Sparta and Athens, but it's also true between any other two Greek city-states. Thebes had the national hero of Oedipus, right? Which is going to change your understanding of yourself and your city if it's Oedipus instead of Theseus, or instead of Heracles or what have you. So yeah, the tendency to abstract the Greeks and overgeneralize about them, I think, is well taken. I think Joseph, then Sharon, then Donald.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to just really briefly come back to this idea that power makes us blind. And reading at I actually highlighted the same paragraph that I guess Dave did, where he speaks about, in my life, I have heard plenty of conversations among adults that left me not wondering in the least how they could come to be outflanked by strategery of a very little child. More and more, moderns seem to be waking up to the scale of oxymoron that democratist myths like common sense or conventional wisdom are. And I guess I just want to make sure I'm making this link correctly. Is that speaking to the idea of the wisdom of slaves, that the common sense and the conventional wisdom that doesn't work for everybody is essentially being perverted by the power structure that is currently in place? Yes. And how does that relate to essentially to Aristotle's politics? In a way, so I understand his criticisms of democracy, but how does that relate? How does that power structure? How are those two related?
So, okay, before I do that, I have to talk about Democritus versus democratic.
Okay,
because Aristotle in the Athenian constitution counterposes a good form and a bad form of each of the core forms of government. And that applies to democracy as well, that there's two different forms. And he says that the main difference is it just the rule of the majority, with or without minority rights? It doesn't matter. Is it just the rule of the majority? Or is it the rule of a majority who are united around common principles and archai? Not just goals, but that there are virtues that they hold sacred and that they would never vote to trample. He says that form is the best form of democracy and possibly the best form of government. But the form in which the majority just rules arbitrarily based on how they feel today, that's the worst form of government.
Right.
Better to have a tyrant than to have that. So when he says democratist here, he means the second form.
Okay.
He's specifically going after populist, democratist, designed to appeal to as many people as possible, and yet not in accordance with any principle, just from a utilitarian ability to manipulate people perspective. And that's what he's critiquing here, is this idea that when politicians put on a mask of folksiness and pretend they're just like we are, and everybody's smart enough, they've all got common sense and there's nothing to learn, and we're all however we are right now is just fine. The reason they do that is because they've had polling groups study what the common sense perspectives are, and they know how to manipulate them. And he's about to do it. Like every time they engage in that folksiness, it's the prelude to, now that you're primed and remember that, allow me to pull all your levers and push all your buttons in order to get you to do what I want you to do. And that's what he's critiquing here.
Okay.
That common sense isn't meme that goes around. He's saying that's a good thing that people are starting to question the idea of common sense, because it should be questioned. It's a hazard when people assume the things that they ought to be striving to understand, and they just assume that they have them. Like we're all free, we're all grown-ups. We all know enough. We all more or less see things right. All that stuff. Those are incredibly dangerous ideas that get us into trouble. And he says myth here, but he really means an anti-myth. Right? Okay. He's talking about an anti-myth. This isn't a true myth because these ideas don't lead us to harmony with the cosmos. They lead us into artificial manipulability. So
I'm also understanding the parent-child relationship a little bit better now as to why he went into that.
Yes.
That makes a lot more sense now that I understand this relationship right here. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. And part of what's hiding in this paragraph you've pulled out is this idea that, just like without the example of Surya Bonali and Simone Biles and the Williams sisters in tennis and so forth, without these concrete, tangible examples, we wouldn't know people could be that good. In the same way, we often forget how bad people can be, not just as individual psychopaths, but as an entire anti-civilization, as an entire anti-culture. How far down does the abyss go? The fundamental challenge of Homo sapiens is that we are neither good nor bad, but extremely malleable with such a wide range that we can be the best of the best or the worst of the worst. We can be angels or demons or anything in between. And that not only presents us with astonishing opportunities to do good in the world, it presents us with astonishing threats and dangers. And it's why the archaic Greeks thought the most important thing in the world for any culture was to put every resource at their disposal to focus on anthropoculture, on trying to bend the curve, the average for human beings, away from the demonic and abysmal and towards the angelic, the eristic, the good, so that the culture, would move away from that terrible hazard and accomplish the great things that are possible if we're all really, really cultivating one another and ourselves. And this whole discussion in here, when you know that that's one of Kenneth Smith's core concerns, and that as a core concern, it's also a core concern of the archaic Greeks. That's why he's bringing it forward. You can sort of hear that bell ringing behind these sentences you called out. That the thing we should be watching out for is we really need to focus on how to cultivate as many savvy people as we can, and then use them as levers to try to help cultivate everybody else to be as good as they can become, so that we, as Martin Luther King says, we can bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice, right? Thank you for that, Joseph.
Thank you.
So I think it's Sharon, then Donald, then Ginny?
Well, I have two comments. One, I wanted to respond to Phil. talking about how the Black students didn't know about Malcolm X, and fast forwarded to Mitch McConnell saying to include slavery in the textbooks would be to increase polarization. And so the fact that they didn't know is probably because of the content of the educational curricula to which they were exposed. Personal experience, I had a 6-year-old one day who had the day off, and it was Martin Luther King Day. So I said, oh, so what are we gonna do today? Why are you off today? He had no idea. Well, the principal of that school heard from me. This was a private school, and I was paying her. So she heard, and he got a project to do, to which the whole class and subsequently the whole school got to listen. This was a private school, predominantly white, but that was inexcusable. They all had the day off. So that's my point about the content of the educational curricula raises the awareness and hence the education for populace. Now, my next point is, not being very philosophical, is I find all of this very, very interesting. And so the first question I have is, how many of you are parents here? Parents? Just 2, 3, or 3, 4? Well, you know, because there is a boundary between letting the infant, even from the newborn, have his way, and then not having his way. There is, and because there's no book on parenting that human being that you've brought into the world, it's a major experiment until they get to 18 years old. So I find all of this very, very interesting, but I don't know how applicable it is. And because I am that kind of person, I look at philosophy, it's a guide for living, and I try to find the wisdom. And the first thing is, this is written by a man who probably doesn't do most of the child rearing, you know, Kenneth Smith. And so I am trying to find the wisdom in all of this. When you have a 4-week-old who's yelling in the middle of the night for no good reason, how does all of this apply?
Well, the critical point is that it applies in a non-linear, non-measurable way.
Okay.
That's why there's no recipe book that we could just mechanically follow. There's this constant bringing all of your creativity to bear on the interaction with the child to figure out when is it time to set limits and when is it time to remove limits and let them express themselves, and that it's constantly shifting from sometimes minute to minute, sometimes second to second, depending on how up they are at the moment, as far as, it's like, yes, okay, try things, but no, not the knife in the electric socket. It's like, and it could be on the turn. Literally yesterday, I was with my sister at my dad's birthday party. That was literally what happened. Is like the one moment that the child is, laughing and talking with us and engaging, and the next minute it was go right for the light socket, and we're like, nope. and that. What you just described is, sort of illustrates what he's talking about here, is that our attempts to understand Archaic or to develop Aristoi, to try to develop Vernunft, part of what we're developing is that fluid capacity to rush back and forth very quickly between accepting the situation and controlling the situation. And not to over control, but not to under control, not to over accept, but not to under accept, and that it's constantly flickering and moving around. And as a result, it has, even in a way in which you can finitely describe the Begriff experience of life, and you can finitely describe the Verstand thinking about or analyzing or learning about life. You can't do that with Vernunft, because Vernunft has this rapidly cycling, infinitizing quality driven by mysterious, obscure intuition, right? Intuition plays an enormous role in, I have a feeling the screaming is about to start. It's like, and where does that understanding come from? Well, it's hard to pin down how it is that you're learning these patterns in the infant or the toddler.
Can I take a shot at this?
Sure, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that when the infant is crying at 4 a.m. and you go and try to comfort it, and you believe you are the parent and you are teaching the infant how to be in the world and how to grow up and teaching it when it can be itself and when it should be held back and let go and so forth. I think what Kenneth Smith here in this essay is reminding us that we also have a lot to learn from the child. Specifically, we have something to learn about how we have been manipulated through the culture as we grow up and become adults, as is necessary just to survive in this culture. We necessarily become manipulated by the whole hyperlogos culture, and children are not yet incapacitated in such a way. And so the essay is reminding us that we can learn as well as teach from these children. And in fact, sometimes they exceed our own capacity as adults in many ways. And those are interesting. And he gives a couple examples in the essay. And maybe that makes it more practical. Does that sort of set in? Anything, Sharon?
No, it does not. In fact, that just simply confuses it. Because when you have a crying infant at 4 a.m, I mean, hyperlogos, mythos, and logos is the last thing you think about, actually, right? And I don't think that the approach is, my approach was certainly not that. So, and I see, and so as I'm struggling
That's
with
exactly
it,
the point.
Yeah,
That's exactly the point.
Dave, I am trying to find the application for a past experience. That's what I'm struggling to find here. So,
because it's the last thing you would think of in that situation,
right.
There's value
So-
in examining it now, right?
I want to speak. That's the
And
reason
have
why
you,
women have breast. You put
could
them to
I-
the breast and they quiet.
And could I say something, Rick?
Sure.
Sure, go ahead, Ginny.
And it's very interesting as I was raising my child. My sister, for example, bought all the books about raising a child, Dr. Spock's, blah, 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 child psychology, subscribe to child psychology, blah, blah. But I didn't do any of that. And I found, sort of indirectly, that a lot of these people who write about how to raise a child very often are not really parents themselves. They're like PhD in child psychology, or
that's why I asked how many of you are parents.
Yeah, and so what do they really know about raising children? And not only that, every child is different. And so, for example, when my son was 2 years old or 3 years old, my neighbor parents were saying, oh, you should let your child learn how to sleep on his own, just put him in the crib and just walk away, and he'll eventually, get used to sleeping alone. My son cried for, I don't know, hour and a half, 2 hours, nonstop. I couldn't stand it. So after that first night, I said, forget it. You come and sleep with us, And so he turned out fine. But again, it's interesting how people really don't have expertise, claim to have expertise and write about how to do this and do that and all that sort of thing. Anyway, and while I have the floor, if you want to call it, I just have a technical question, Rick.
Yeah.
I don't know if I need to sign up at a different place for this meeting. I got the invitation for this meeting today or this morning, I think. And the meeting said, the invitation said only David Roel and I would be at the meeting, and the meeting would be 1 hour. So am I doing something wrong? Should I sign up somewhere else to get the email timely? And
so are you getting an email message? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I get an invitation email, but last 2 weeks I've been getting it on the day of the meeting on Monday, as opposed to a week earlier or whatever. So I don't know what's going on.
So what I do is on the day of the seminar, every Monday in the morning, I go to the meetup site, and the meetup site.
And the meetup site would be David Roel's Mythos and Logos meetup site. Is that
no? I mean
one?
meetup.com. If you go to the
meetup.com.
webpage meetup.com, then on the homepage at the very top of the listing will be all of the events for today, and you'll see Mythos and Logos there. You can click on it
with a link as well.
Yeah.
With a link. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought the link came through like half an hour before the meeting or something.
Yeah, about 15 minutes before the meeting, he adds the link to this, but the page is there, quite in advance. So.
Okay.
So that's
so I got the invitation this morning, and then when I was ready to come in, like 10 minutes before the meeting started, I realized there was no link.
Right.
And it just said David Royale. There were only 2 people coming into the meeting, just David Royale and me. And then I come into the meeting, and there are like 10 people already here. So, okay, so I need to do something differently. Okay, go to meetup.com. Okay.
Yeah, meetup.com. That's always the route I go through. Your point about the parenting and the parent-child experiences, that building upon what Marianne and Sharon said, I think is right on the money here. That what's tricky is the person who told you to just let them cry was trying a Verstand approach. They had a recipe that they wanted to apply equally to all children.
Yeah.
Right. It's a finite solution to what's an infinite problem. And it's an infinite problem because every child is different.
Right.
That's the second infinity of that I was talking about with the example of the cell, where even though they're all alive, they all express their life differently in every different cell in a way that adapts them to their circumstances. And in the case of an infant, the infant is on the one hand adapting to its own internal nature, its character. And at the same time, it's trying to adapt to the external nature around it, what it's experiencing, what's happening. And the intersection between the two is always guaranteed to be unique. Even if it happens to fit some pattern, it will only fit that pattern because of the nature of that intersection between the nature around us and the nature within us. And that's infinitizing. And that's why finite strategies that Verstand specializes in don't work. It's not good enough. It's like what's going to happen is that somebody who's committed to the Verstand way of life, who's an ultra intellectual, is going to go through life telling everybody to do this thing, and whenever it works, they'll remember it and take it as proof that their strategy works. And whenever it doesn't work, they'll forget about it, and then they'll take their forgetting as proof that their strategy works. And this is how Verstand cherry picks evidence in order to support itself. Because the human mind has an infinite capacity to play foreground background games with its own experiences and memories and make the inconvenient truths disappear into the background. And then it seems to have proven what it wants to believe. This is the way that so many people accuse, for example, Christian fundamentalists of being irrational, but it's because they don't understand the nature of reason. Verstand is a perfectly rational process. You can do the craziest things, seemingly, for completely rational, logical reasons. The ability to play foreground, background games and cherry pick evidence is built into the structure of our reason as human beings. And it's what makes it extraordinarily difficult for us to try to live any kind of a life like a Vulcan, where we're all rational and logical all the time, is that our reason will simultaneously be operating in order to fulfill unreasonable things underneath it. It's just how we're wired. So, part of why he's talking about parents and child, you can see it in the very second sentence of this essay. He says, in this case, it is mother nursing child that is at issue. The gentle but taxing art of persuading. Remember, persuasion is one of Kenneth Smith's keywords. Patho, the goddess of persuasion of the Archaic Greeks. Persuading a little psyche to want, but not want, and now I'm going to interject, not want in the way that it wants to want, but instead to be transformed into wanting in a rhythmic and moderated way what is reasonable and good for it. That is, learn to sleep through the night. Learn to be hungry only when your parents can get some sleep, so that, the full relationship of you plus us is a going concern, and not just you wrecking me in order to get what you want. Learning the whole, how to create a sustainable whole. that is what's going on when you're trying to persuade them to sleep through the night. And he's saying, this is the same process that continues on with us beyond infancy. Watching the infant situation gives us like watching Simone Biles, it gives us a crystal clear example to use to then apply to more complex situations where it might not be as clear. So how do we become persuaded to fit ourselves into modernity? How do we become persuaded to adopt roles as consumers and as workers and fans and voters instead of the full range of experience of life? How do we agree to segment our political interactions into these moments of voting or of writing a letter or whatever is on our list of things that we think of as politics? We had to be trained into it in exactly the same way we had to be trained into sleeping through the night so that our mom could get a break. You know what I mean? There is the same processes at work in us.
That is very, very helpful, and is helping me to make the connection now, which is what I was struggling with when I first read this essay.
Yay.
Yeah, one person who knows how to articulate, Mr. Marshall.
Well, part of it is you ask the questions the way that you ask them, and it makes me look at the essay in a new way. It helps me to look at different sides of it. So yeah, and so he says, and to begin,
this is the beef. This is part of the beef.
This is part of the beef. And to begin also the lifelong task of assimilating what is civilized and graceful. So this is the second part of what he's talking about. So first, it's about wanting in a rhythmic and moderated way what's reasonable and good for it. That's fitting into the larger system and creating a larger whole. But then it's about assimilating what is civilized and graceful. In other words, things you might not have wanted at all. We're not just trying to train your wants that you have. We're trying to train you to want things that you didn't want before. Mm-hmm. Like to want to be a good person, to want to be generous, to want to strive for excellence. You aren't born with any of these literally, but you're born with the capacity to want these things, even though you don't start out wanting them. It's within the circle of potential of a human being. But you're never going to grow into that outer circle unless someone helps cultivate in you the desire, helps you have experiences that show you how rewarding it can be to be kind to somebody, or to master a skill you never had before, or to help shape a culture. All these things, they have to be drawn out of us so that we unfold into them. Like a tree, we have all this potential for growth. We could put our branches anywhere, but it's the specific situation we find ourselves in that encourages us not to grow branches in some places and to grow them in other places instead. And so the culture has an enormous effect, but it's not a Verstand controlling effect. We can't just stamp people out like little units, right? Because it's not just what's outside of them, but also what's inside of them that's helping to determine the direction and the shape of what's going on. So this is what he's doing in this sentence, this second sentence in this whole thing. And he's really trying to, but what I think is hilarious is the second clause in the sentence. And in all of this, nature has seen fit to supply even the hapless, helpless infant with a respectable, instinctual, or unreflective arsenal of sharp little forms of anti-music that do the very opposite of soothing the savage breast. Now, in a moment, he talks about teeth. And so obviously the infant biting teeth, biting the breast, not a newborn, but, not that far down the road is one of the things he's talking about here. But he deliberately didn't say teeth to start with because he's actually referring to all the forms of anti-music. Music is a sound. So the screech, not the happy screech, but that particular reverberating wail that newborns can do that makes it impossible to sleep and impossible to ignore. And like Ginny said, it's like, I'm not going to let that kid sleep through that. I simply must intervene because, oh my God, my skull is reverberating, right? They're born with that capacity specifically in order to manipulate people who have more power and potential than they do, right? Our susceptibility to that sound is built into us for the same reason that they have built into them the ability to generate the sound. They're complementary. It's not a coincidence. It's teleology. And the teleology of the whole is formed by the different parts growing into a shape so that they respond to each other to make a greater whole. Be bad for evolution if parents could ignore children. They wouldn't make it out of infancy.
That's right.
So we're built with these complementary features. And so what he's arguing is the same is true, God help us, of gnosis and noesis and their relationship to each other. And the same is true of Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft. They have relationships to each other necessarily, organically, teleologically, for evolutionary purposes. Vernunft isn't just some cool icing on the cake. It's not, if you do Vernunft, you get to be one of the cool kids. Vernunft serves a necessary evolutionary and biological purpose in the survival of human beings and human culture. And it is designed to reciprocate to the needs of Begriff and Verstand in the same way that the parent is designed to reciprocate to the needs of the infant. There's a lot going on in this essay.
Yeah, I'm seeing that now.
He's it's we've talked before about the way that he's not a Kantian linear philosopher who simply says what he means. He's often trying to talk about things that it's very hard to say, but it's not so hard if you give examples. And so that's why art and poetry and music and all these things are sort of being brought to bear. And also he just likes this stuff, right? He read Heraclitus and was amazed at Heraclitus's ability to use short, pithy examples to say deep, profound things. So he's always looking for an opportunity to use a phrase like sharp little forms of anti-music so that he can say like 12 things at the same time. You know, if you slow down and look at it, you can realize there's all these implications waiting to be unpacked. He just lives for that stuff. All right, so we have a line I've long since lost track of. I think Donald is next, and then Mary.
Donald. I'll keep track for you.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Go ahead, Donald.
Oh, I've talked about so much since I thought I wanted to say something. I'm not sure how many items are on the list, but when you talked about the hierarchical nature and the fact that as beings within nature, we're not all equal in the duty of the rest of us. I still think within a hierarchical system of human beings, there's a place for consent. Now, I don't know what Aristotle said, but I know in Plato's Republic, it's often reviled, the noble lie, but a way to sort of take the structure that human society needed to be shaped into and form it into a myth understandable by Thanassoi and Duloi. So that they could, as best they can, consent, so that they understood something about how, and while people may not be equal, we have seen the term in the Greeks of isonomos. The law can be the same. The people may not be the same, can't in fact be the same, and aren't in fact the same, but the law can apply the same. I mean, it'll have different results when applied to different people, but there's not a special law for each, you know, we don't go and say, this is your type, therefore these are the laws for you. You know, maybe that's the law forbids the poor and the wealthy from sleeping on the park bench, but there is some egalitarian. And for Phil, who the Spartan army loved to dance, the power of the army lay in the phalanx And the power of the phalanx was its ability to move as one. And so the Spartans were renowned throughout Greece as the best dancers, because they silently, in their head, as they entered battle, danced to the rhythms that they had practiced and made them phenomenal. So they were artists in a way. I'm not, I kind of think that. And then about this whole thing about children reminds me that I think that somehow, if you don't have children, you never understand your own parents. So in a sense, whether it's, gosh, it would interfere with going to happy hour or having 3 vacations a year or whatever, when moderns say, oh, we're better off not marrying and we're better off not having children, they're making sort of a Banausic calculation, very Verstand. It's just dollars and cents. But they've also cut themselves off from something that's necessary for their own humanization. You now that I'm not say I saw it in myself and my wife. That you say you don't understand your parents until you have children yourself. I asked my wife once, how many times did you say to your mother, you don't love me, you've never loved me, and now that you have a child, you finally know that she always loved you? So that's enough.
Can I just say something, Donald? So I have a 8-year-old, and he's pretty precocious and he's being difficult. And I'm just exasperated because one of the things I was when he was coming up and I was a single parent, I was tired all the time. And one day in my exasperation, I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. He looked at me, he says, Mom, it's all fiscology. Don't you know it's all fiscology? I said, well, how do you spell fiscology? And he spelled psychology, right? So in other words, if I just used a little psychology, we would get by.
He was inviting you to psych him out.
That's right.
Wow. That's really amazing. I gotta sit with that for a moment.
Psychology.
Yeah, there's this sense in which when we talk about, Begriff Douloi and Banausoi and Aristoi, the danger is that we get too far away from concrete examples.
Mm-hmm.
And we start to treat them as Kantian abstractions, which is exactly what Hegel didn't want to have happen. He says that's where all the error is, right? To abstract is to be an error. So the only good way to talk about these things is to constantly be bringing them back to concrete examples. It's why this essay is about his family. It's like he wants to use what for him at that moment were the most potent examples he was feeling and thinking about to illustrate these ideas. So one of the things that becomes clear when you deal with real people instead of imaginary categories of people is that issue of enormous variation, right? That there is a huge variation in potential and in actuality between people. And there is a error it's easy to slip into of thinking that the way that this works is that the really bad ones are the Douloi, and that the moderate ones are the Banausoi and the really good ones are the Aristoi, because that's a Kantian scheme that you could easily slip into, aligning reality and jamming it into this threefold schema from worst to best, nice and linear and nice measurable, but it's completely false. That's not what he means at all. even within a doulos, somebody ruled by their appetites.
Mhm.
You know, I've mentioned a few times that the range of possibility for doulic human beings is more like a strange attractor than it is like a point. There's enormous numbers of people orbit in their own different ways around the tendency to be driven by your experiences and your immersion in life. And so as a result, there are really different ways to be a doulos. And you can have a culture in which douloi are remarkably good people, and you really want to be around them, and you're all going to learn stuff and benefit from being around them. And there's other cultures in which douloi are just awful, and you know the culture tears itself to pieces in you know feuds and you know one of the examples given in a satyr play about Oedipus and Polyphemus is of Polyphemus. There's a famous quote about Polyphemus saying he doesn't respect the gods. Why should he? And he gives all the reasons why he's not afraid of Poseidon and he's not afraid of Zeus and so on. He says the only god I care about is my stomach. I worship my stomach and I'll do anything to make my stomach happy, and that's why I'm going to eat you, because nothing that you have matters as much as what I have. I have my God and I need to make my God happy. And this is a description of a sort of a demonic doulic perspective in which your appetites rule you completely. But the range of possibilities for douloi go way away from that. You know, that's just one possibility. Douloi could also just be really generous, kind people living a relatively simple life, but with a lot of wisdom that they've learned from the culture around them, and that who want to be kind. So, this thing about how you raise children and how you interact with them, I would contrast with Plato's lie, where he tries to lie people into doing the right thing, where he talks about that, and say that a Kenneth Smithian take is a little more nuanced than that. A lie gives you too much control. It's too verstand. The reference to persuasion, to persuading here, is the critical thing. It's like, when you write as an author, your book's not going to be very good if you don't know who your audience is, because your perspective is going to waver all over the place. Your arguments are going to waver all over. You don't know how to describe things because you don't know who's listening or who's reading. And that what makes a book sing is when you know your audience really well. You not only have something worth saying, you know who you're saying it to, and you can say it in the ways that they'll really understand, that they'll love having this told to them, right? That they will delight in it, in the journey and in the exploration. And that's only possible if you know your audience. So when he talks about persuading, what he's talking about here is that it is incumbent upon Aristoi to cultivate artistry and communication and psychology so that they can learn their audience, not just of other Aristoi, but of douloi and banausoi, and learn how to tell stories in a way that capture the imagination of the douloi and banausoi and make them long to participate in a culture like that. You're persuading them at the level they can operate on. You can't persuade them by appealing to Archaic because they don't believe in Archaic and they can't perceive Archaic. But you can appeal to the douloi through their experiences. And you can appeal to the banausoi through their ideas and education. And you try to use those to lure them to persuade, not under false pretenses, but to genuinely persuade them to participate. Just like with the child, there's a time to grab the child to stop him from running into traffic.
That's
and
right.
then, but if that's not actually necessary, you don't want to just keep them wrapped up in swaddling cloth all the time, because you know that they need to explore and exercise and learn what it's like to interact with the world. And so you're trying to let them be themselves while also persuading them through example, for example, to try to grow into being a more realized human being. So that's what's going on here in this opening. Okay, who's next? Is it Marianne next, Sharon?
No, it's Phil.
It's Phil. Go, Phil, go.
Yeah, I kind of want to respond to Sharon, but it's more of a confession rather than a response.
I'm listening. I'm all ears.
I'm not a father. The best I could say is that I was an uncle. And that's interesting because, and I realize why I'm not a father, because I do not have enough patience to be present at all the time. And I knew that's what is needed, is to have that kind of patience. I remember once I was sort of like with my daughter, my niece. She was very, very young. She was the first child. She was maybe less than a year. Children already crawling around, and I'm sort of like, where? And I happened to be sitting at the end of the couch. So that was an accident. So she's crawling around, and then I suddenly, through the corner of my eye, saw her falling. Luckily, I was there, and I just caught her by her head and broke the fall. And I realized that if I had been slightly further away, she could have hurt herself very seriously, possibly even break her neck. So then I realized that, like, I wasn't present enough, even though I was there with them. So that kind of absence, I think women are present more than men. That's all there is to it. Okay. So I'm thinking like that was part of the reason, but I would try to be a good uncle. And I remember this one African guy who's now an American, but he came from Nigeria. And we were in a fellowship together in San Diego. And he visited our family a couple of times, and he saw how close I was with my nephew and nieces. And at one point, he actually said, Phil, you're actually a good father. You're a better father than the real father. I just thought that was kind of a partial compliment and sort of like a metaphor as well, So I just sort of brushed it off. And I was a good uncle in this sense. And the reason why I was a good uncle is because I'm the kind of person who always trying to look for the cracks in society. So I'm always doing things, and I think they learn something from that, leaping over the stereotypes. And so that was a good thing. But I'm always now looking back a little disappointed how much they have, in some sense, not learned from me. Then later on, and because I think there's so many influences in society. Later on, several years later, I remember going to Babatunde's house, this black fellow, extremely smart, right? Extremely smart. And I made a purpose when we won the fellowship together. I wanted a black person, and he turns out to be the smartest guy there. So that was crazy. How I knew that was that he was a good speaker and a good politician and extremely smart. And when we go to a talk together, he will always wait until I ask a question. Now, this was not planned by me, at least. I think it was planned by him. And then, of course, the guy would try to answer as best he could and dodge the question to a certain degree. And then he would always ask a follow-up question. He would nail the guy. So I knew he was a good politician, a good rhetorician. And when I was at his house, he had kids, and this daughter, which I like very much, actually, was acting kind of naughty, running around. He's trying to control her. So I made kind of a snide joke to him. I said, "How are you going to be considered?" He was thinking maybe he might go back to Nigeria and run for political office. How could you even pretend to be the father of the country when you can't even control your own kids? So that was interesting, And then I think then I reflected back an earlier story he told me that actually what he meant about me being a good father was actually not a metaphor, but a real comment, because he came from a matrilineal culture. Okay, not a maternalistic culture, but a matrilineal culture. And in such a culture, what happened is that, the child always belongs to the woman. Men could come in and out, and you never are quite sure who the father really is.
Oh,
okay.
No.
That's, well,
you certainly know who the mother is, because the baby comes right out of her, right?
That's
There's
right.
like no mistaking who the mother is.
And so what happens is the real male figure in such a culture was the uncle. And he, in fact, acts as the father of the household. Okay. And so he literally means that uncle coming in and teaching the children what they need to learn from a male example versus a female example. That's what he really meant, that I was a good father, that I was acting in this sort of other role to come in, and be a father figure, and a male figure in their sense. So it was not a metaphor, it was real. So that was interesting, how a different culture could have a completely interpretation of what fatherhood is, because that actually is the case. That the uncle was a very, very important figure, because it related to the mother and is the most prominent, permanent figure in the household, so to speak, right? So in that sense, that was very interesting, that I learned that, okay, I was judging it from a Western standard, and he was saying it actually from another cultural standard, which is very, very interesting. And okay, if you want to put it that way, maybe I was a good father, because I was a very good uncle. So there, once again, you just cannot judge another culture without understanding what that culture is about. So that was very interesting. But my comment still stands: how do you plan to be the father of a nation when you can't even control your own children? And this is the thing that we have to give credit to women for, is like, they have the patience to put up with all that nonsense, which I would just go out of my mind, right? Not that I'm not willing to be there, but it's like, at some point I just say, oh no, man, this is like, I can't deal with it. Could you take over, please? That sort of thing. So I think that's an important little sideline to tell you, that little story about being a parent. And that's why, I think now women are asked to do both jobs. I know my sister had a very difficult job, because the father, the real father in this case, is quite absent. So she had to be a very dominant figure in the household as well. And quite often, because she's a trained lawyer, she doesn't have the patience as well. So it was like, so in some sense, that feminine figure was partially missing even in her. So that they kind of had a difficult time growing up, I think.
Okay.
So the example of uncles is very interesting there, because the adjective avuncular describes that. And certainly you see in cultures all over the world, the family relationship you're describing is in fact the dominant one, that it's women's brothers, not their spouses or their lovers, who adopt the paternal role. Partly, because if we go back far enough in prehistory, people didn't know who the father was, right? So, but you did know that, so-and-so was my brother. So if I'm going to have a kid, my brother's a more reliable family figure than whoever it might be that, I had sex with. This creates the notion of an avuncular role in a child's life. And the avuncular role is not as authoritative as the paternal role under patriarchy. Because you're not the father of me totally applies to the uncle, right? It's like there's certain forms of Verstand coercion, colonizer culture, patriarchal culture coercion that are not available to the uncle. And as a result, the uncle has to persuade and suggest and seduce and lure and capture the imagination of the children to help instruct them. And this model of non-authoritarian instruction is closely related to what mothers have to do with infants, where you can control some of what they do, but if you try to control everything they do, you'll wreck them. And so there is this, again, balancing act between when do you intervene and when do you just try to lure them in. And the reason this is highly relevant is Greek polytheism had a great deal of this in its structure. Nietzsche wrote a lot about the difference between Judaism and Christianity on the one hand, the Middle Eastern kind of authoritarian monotheistic religions, versus Greek polytheism. And one of his most famous quotes on this topic is, "No Greek god ever told a Greek, 'Thou shalt.'" That whole commandments, do what I say or you burn in hell forever thing was not a part of the Greek worldview. And you can read modern author after modern author attempting to depict Hades as equivalent to hell and the Elysian fields as the equivalents of heaven, but it's totally different from a moral, ontological, and cosmological perspective, because heaven and hell are part of a law of the excluded middle extremist reward punishment system to compel obedience under threat of destruction. You know, the carrot and the stick are both enormous, and they're going to beat the shit out of you until you do what they say, is the structure of the cosmology, of the theology in those Middle Eastern religions. But in the Greek religion, Hades wasn't a punishment. That's where people went when they died. Even the Elysian fields were part of Hades, right? And the spirits of the dead were not living on forever after death. They were more like reflections or shades left over from the living person, not the person themselves. And when in the Odyssey, when Odysseus goes to Hades and needs advice and, you know, pours the blood out for the shades to sample so that he can hear the advice of the dead person who will speak, he's not paying them a price to get their cooperation. He's not bribing them. He's adding more life to them so that they're less like a shade and more like the person they used to be, so that they're capable of speech and will, which they aren't in their natural state. They're more like smoke, or like, you know, like it's like arguing with your reflection, shadow boxing. So they had this, so the whole cosmology of reward and punishment is missing from the Greek cosmos. And it means that even though the Greek deities were representing authoritative forces in the universe, they themselves took on a human face to communicate with us. They were humanizing those forces to put them into a form that we could understand and relate to. And when they were in that form, when it was Zeus not as lightning bolts from the sky, but Zeus as a guy with a beard, he couldn't command you. The lightning could command you. The heavens can command you. But Zeus himself couldn't command you. He could only advise. You see this over and over in the Iliad and the Odyssey, where the deities whisper in the ear of the hero, right? And it's through that advice. If they choose to listen to the advice, then they can accrue the benefits of aligning themselves with the great forces that these deities represent. And that's why Nietzsche says, no Greek god ever told a Greek, thou shalt. When they say know thyself, it's not know thyself or will damn you to hell for all time, like you'd expect in a Christian cosmology. It would be a really good idea if you dealt with the problem that you are for yourself and everybody around you. We're suggesting from our avuncular, you know, aunt or uncle like perspective that this is something you really need to attend to. So everything you're talking about, Phil, it's directly relevant to the way that the Greeks imagined that the Olympians and other deities wielded authority over us in their humanized aspects. They could only advise. And this then becomes the metaphor for the Aristoi. What is the role of an Aristos within a culture? And it is, again, to advise and to put things into their most persuasive possible form so that Banausoi and Duloi can understand it well enough to see why they ought to do those things, not because they were driven to it by the whip. Because there's limits to what you can do through overt control.
Dave
now,
next.
Yeah, okay, we'll call on Dave next. So the problem, Greek culture fell short of that all the damn time, right? The way that they approached slaves, especially Sparta, but everywhere, fell short of that all the time. But that was what they were striving to emulate, is that relationship between the Olympians and everybody else. So, okay, Dave's next. Go, Dave, go.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about the attitude of what am I getting out of this? And of course, that's an important and perfectly natural question. But I think it also perfectly illustrates what Kenneth is talking about in this actual essay, that we have become so acculturated by market forces that we view almost all relations as transactional, and that we must be getting something out of it, as opposed to just the opportunity to think through these things in and of itself is sort of enjoying the journey instead of the destination. So just, bringing that up. And I think speaking to what Sharon was saying earlier, Rick, you were reading a paragraph on page 83. It was in fact the first paragraph of the essay. And the last sentence is precisely what Sharon was talking about, the cries of the infant at 4 a.m. He says, the infant's cries are piercing and unnerving, not by accident. Their pain is instinctively translatable into our terms as our pain and distress also. But we never wonder at this primal coordination. And isn't that interesting?
Yes.
So I just thought that was very, I just love how Kenneth writes.
Yes.
Can I respond to Dave very quickly on that? Dave, I don't know if you could look at an entity like understanding as transactional. So let me put that out there. I don't understand. For me, understanding means application, and I don't know if that process is transactional. That's the first thought.
An example of transactional would be, well, why should I be good? Are you going to pay me? If you're going to pay me, then I'll do it. Or if does being good mean that, I get to eat, or, I get a reward, or I get a wife, like all of the women who are used as rewards for heroes and fairy tales and Star Wars and all kinds of other things, in those scenarios, the reason to be a good person is so that you get the reward, and there's no other reason. That's also the case in the classical Christian cosmology, where the reason to be good is so that you get heaven and you manage to avoid hell, not because you should be a good person for its own sake, but because there's a reward, a little carrot. So that's what he means by transactional. And the marketplace tries to reduce all human interactions to transactional interactions. You have to pay for everything, or other people have to pay you. And if they're not paying you, why should you even do it?
What was Luke Skywalker's reward?
Well, everybody at the end of Star Wars gets a medal except for Princess Leia.
Oh. Okay, fair enough.
So she's put into the role of part of the reward. She smiles beatifically upon them, and then Han and Luke can wonder which of them gets to have Leia. And the medal is their little token of entry, if you will. This has been much critiqued. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people think that the idea that Luke and Leia were sisters and that they were the children of Darth Vader was not in George Lucas's mind when he first made Star Wars, because the structure of it suggests instead that it was a princess and a hero, and the hero wanted to win the princess, and it had a classic structure. Empire Strikes Back really twisted up and the Return of the Jedi really twisted up those relationships and made you go, ew. why he was kissing his sister? Ew. But But you could see the transactionality in it, in that regard. Also, revenge, right? They killed Uncle O and an Aunt Beru. You killed my family, so I'm going to blow up your Death Star. Screw you. So there's a lot of transactionality. This is why in Athens they wouldn't accept the testimony of slaves, because someone who operates at a slavish level is still operating according to transactions, what they want and what are they going to get out of it. And if they're at that level, it means they're too easy to manipulate or distract from the truth. And the truth is what you need.
What about like somebody like I'm sorry, I'm jumping, but what about Epictetus or somebody like that? I mean,
well, by the time we get to him, we're talking Romans, right?
No, okay.
That's a whole other kettle of fish. The Romans were a piece of work.
Marianne.
Yeah, Marianne, go ahead.
It's such an interesting conversation. I have a lot of thoughts, and I usually don't like talking out loud too much, so I will try to get my thoughts out. That primal coordination makes me think of the instinct to choose a mate. And when we choose a mate, we are often looking for somebody outgoing and kind, like charming. And I've been just recently studying things that suggest that a lot of times people can be duped by liars or narcissists. And so you can choose somebody who thinks, you would have that primal coordination to achieve a good relationship. And it's also because we are naive people that we have a tendency to believe people that can lie to us. But what I really wanted to talk about was that non-nurturing, that sense of controlling kids is not true. You nurture kids. And I believe that when you nurture them, that you not only learn from the kid, you relearn how to parent yourself. And it's an opportunity to find a kindness in yourself that is hidden unless you nurture in a good way. If you try to control, you'll never learn that kindness. You never learn that it's palpable kindness, where you put them close to your heart and you can feel their heartbeat slow down. It's a beautiful moment. And kids need that touching. They need that reassurance of a hug. And one way I taught myself patience in this last encounter with a 4-year-old is to know that the corpus callosum, I think, is not developed in a human being until about they're 21. And you can see how they have an immediacy in their actions. And to get them to actually look outside themselves is really hard for the first few years. And I would tell my grandson, look at me, am I happy now? I'm not. And it took me a long time to realize how stern I had to be with him. Again, it's like kids have to have boundaries. And so I found myself smiling in a fake way. It's like, oh, you're so cute and wonderful. And then they cross this boundary and I'm going, so I had to relearn kind of like how to interact with a kid and remind myself that his brain is like a quarter of the size of my brain.
Right.
How he is interpreting the world is a lot more literal. Like I had to leave and he would not wake up in the morning because he thought if he didn't wake up in the morning, I would still be there. It was so enduring.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's in Daughters and Granddaughters, the first essay in this collection. He talks about the way that the utter helplessness of an infant it's like a shockwave on the parent, because the things that you value in life up until your first infant, like other people, when you value other people, they're at least largely formed and they can fend for themselves and they've got teeth and, they can push back, and you're used to interacting with things that You can be a little rough and tumble because they can be a little rough and tumble back. But then you get this infant and it is absolutely fragile. And it's like it utterly can't defend itself. It's like if you don't engage with it in the tenderest way you ever have in your life, where you are absolutely not rough and tumble around it ever during those formative years, it's not going to make it. And you know it. You look right at it and you know immediately that your life strategies up until now have only slightly prepared you for this. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you're going to have to do very differently for the next who knows how long. He mentions that, he alludes to that in the first essay, and how it has a transformative effect on you because it's the first time in your life you've got something like that you care so much about, that's so delicate. It's like, and yet it's not like just a piece of glass that you can just lock it away in a behind, on a shelf somewhere safe. It's like, no, it's going to start interacting with the world and it's still going to be fragile. And you can't say, no, you'll get hurt. Go stay in this room. I'm going to make sure nothing ever hurts you. It's like your heart is constantly leaping into your throat over and over as a parent. And there's only a certain amount that you can do about that. And there's a certain part of it that is irreducibly making you vulnerable, when up until then in your life, you'd work so hard to try to limit your vulnerability. And so it draws forth the yin in us.
How did it happen in the evolution, where we are so evolved, so-called human beings are so evolved, and yet giraffes, for example, giraffes are not the only animals, but they have their baby.
Yeah.
The baby pops out of their body.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, within a couple of hours, they're walking, and yet human babies just stay so helpless for so long.
Yes.
They can't walk. They can't. Yeah. I wonder what happened along there.
So this is one of the places where evolutionary biology has had great breakthroughs. We know the trap that we're in, and it's the brain pelvis trap.
Yes.
A woman's pelvis can only be so wide before she can't walk. And so there's a limit to how far apart her legs can be. And yet we need bigger brains, and the bigger brain can only fit through so much space. And so the only solution of this was effectively we evolved to have premature babies. Mm-hmm. We evolved to give birth to infants before they were fully developed. It was the only solution to that problem. People have looked at it from multiple angles, and it's like it had to go this direction. It was necessity. If our life strategy hadn't been built around our brains, we never would have been in this trap. But once that became our life strategy, we had to give birth to preemies, basically. And there's an interesting author, I got to look up his name again, who's done a bunch of work on neoteny and how it is that we develop without fur into adulthood, and why do we retain our curiosity and affection and a bunch of sort of infantile childlike qualities. And one of the things that he explored is this idea that every bit as important to us as the way that our infants are born so unformed is the way that our children go through multiple stages of life, including some stages of life other animals don't have at all. We have the stage before they have teeth, and then they grow in temporary teeth so that they can be in this sort of little tiny person stage where you don't need the mother to feed them anymore. So she's freed up to reproduce again, which otherwise would be a problem, because with the long extended infancy of our premature babies, we wouldn't be reproducing often enough to keep going as a species. We had a second trap that's less obvious. And so we developed this stage where we have partially developed little people with temporary teeth who are not developed enough to survive on their own in the wild, but are developed enough that the rest of the family, especially grandparents, can help feed the child, and the mother's freed up to start thinking about another child. And if it weren't for that, we would have gone extinct. Just like the crossover with the hip width and the brain growth. Again, another problem of the big fat brains that our species has decided that's our teeth and claws and fur, and that's our trick, right?
I think Leonard Schlein talked about that last week.
Ah, yes. Yeah, it's good stuff.
It's my turn now.
It is.
I like the word that you used about parenting and raising children is transformational. And I want to pick up on what Donald said, because that was very, very good insight. I like that. So before I get on to what I really want to talk about, I just want to make sure I understand something. So the infants are really Verstand, which is being for themselves, for itself, when they're really small. Am I getting that right?
Begriff.
Begriff.
Being in itself.
Being in itself, begriff. And then it moves over to Verstand as it gets older, or it stays in begriffs, being in itself.
Yes, we all, whether we end up being douloi or banausoi, or, in some better culture, aristoi, we all have to develop Verstand. But we're not born with it. We're just born with the capacity for it. And Verstand is what gives us the ability to plan and start controlling.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the other thing on my agenda is this paragraph on page 84, when you're talking about women and child rearing, where they say the natural arete specific to women, the subtle mastery of the mysteries that nature has dealt them in the art of caring for life, learning how to weave a new soul into the rich tapestry of the world. That is something that aristic or discriminated minds learn how to differentiate from the matters that are merely conventional, artificial, and conformist.
Yes.
And this is where I got really confused. And in these and in other valuational matters, our illiterate society at large, in the archaic judgment written on the wall at Belshazzar's feast, mean mene tekel aphorism is sadly weighed in the balance and found wanting. Now, I couldn't make the connection between those between those things. I got the one bit, but Belshazzar's feast, I remember with Nebuchadnezzar and all of that, that was just seemed out of it to me. So I didn't understand.
So let me unpack that for you. That's a good thing to look at. So the point of Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin is that whoever wrote that on the wall was conveying God's judgment on the king. That this is the divine perspective, and that from the divine perspective, it doesn't matter how powerful the king may be. If the king is out of sync with the things that matter the most, then the king is weighed in the balance and found wanting. And he's saying exactly in that same way, nature weighs modernism in the balance and finds it wanting. Because the things that are most important to the survival of our species, which are these amazing arts of Gainea, of how you weave a new soul into a human being, are the things that are valued the least under modernism. There's no money for them. Money is the thing that's valued. We focus instead on, optimizing efficiency in our warehouses so that we can have more profit and make mega billions. We focus on, our realpolitik balance of power with other nuclear nations and who's in charge of what. We focus on maximizing profits for the quarter. All of these things have nothing to do with raising a good generation of people. With the arts of anthropoculture, with paideia, which Kenneth Smith says, and he's echoing Aristotle and other Greeks, is saying is the most important job that Homo sapiens has. If the range of possibilities for a person ranges from the sublime to the demonic, nothing is as important as avoiding the demonic and trying to bend humanity in the direction of the sublime, right? Because if we fail to do that, everything else we try to do will fall apart. We'll tear it apart ourselves. Tragedy teaches us that. Even if we're a virtuous person, we can destroy all our accomplishments through an excess of a good quality or something out of balance. But if we're not even a good person to start with, if instead we've been rewarding the worst in us, the sociopathic, the greedy, the power mongering, if that's what's rising to dominate us and is in charge of organizing how we relate to each other and to the world around us, then we're on a path to self-destruction and to, taking ourselves out, not with a whimper, but with an enormous bang that takes out a lot of other things with it. So he's saying, that arete, that art of how you persuade an immature psyche to grow into something greater should be held up as the pinnacle accomplishment of Homo sapiens. That should be the rewarded thing. That should be the respected thing. That's what we should be focusing on. And instead, under modernism, it's at the bottom of the pile. And therefore, modernism is weighed in the balance and found wanting. That's what he's arguing. By when we compare modernism to nature in terms of these things that Homo sapiens desperately needs for its own survival, it's clear that however powerful modernism may think itself, it's not long for this world. You can't be sabotaging your roots, right? And expect a future.
So the intrinsic nature of the arete is comparable to the mysterious writing on the wall at Belshazzar's feast. That's the analogy?
The analogy would be that the natural arete of women in this context is being equated to what people should have been doing at the time of Belshazzar's feast instead of what they were actually doing. So following God's ways, doing the sacred things that matter. He's basically saying it is a sacred, wholesome, crucial, essential thing, the natural arete of women. And if we didn't have a Middle Eastern monotheist jealous god, if we had a god of nature like the ancient Greeks or the archaic Greeks envisioned, who was trying to fit us more healthily into the world so that we could survive, then that would be part of what that god would tell us to focus on, or goddess would tell us to focus on, is the natural arete of women. The things that they learn and do are the things that we ought to be focusing on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's funny. The only way he's going to draw this comparison is if he spends a lot of time thinking about the mismatch.
Well, he made me look up Belshazzar's feast, and I found out it was a cantata, and it had parts of Psalm 137 and Daniel chapter 4. And the funny thing was, in part of the cantata is this song by the Rivers of Babylon, which is another Bob Marley song. Right? Yeah. Well, the Jews were in exile. So I read that paragraph a bunch of times because I couldn't quite make the link.
There's the guy who wrote American Pie, Don McLean.
Yes.
That album ends with a song about the rivers of Babylon.
Yes, it does. Because of the life of a song, there were many people who wrote about the rivers of Babylon, many singers who brought that up, including Don McLean.
That is just a gorgeous song. He's so sad in that song. Oh my God.
Yes. Well, it's part of my workout music.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. The Bob Marley.
Yes.
Nice.
Every time I hear Bob Marley, I think of Sharon now. I'm not kidding. I had to say that.
In fact, this was before Bob Marley copied it. This was written by, reggae followed another Jamaican rhythm called the ska. And so this was written by a group called the Melodians. And this was a very, very early. But what it is cultures that suffer and are oppressed. And Babylon was really, was the way they termed Western Orthodoxy, which was oppressive. That's what Babylon represented.
Right. The very next paragraph after the one that you were quoting has some amazing stuff in it. There is a refutation of the modernist idea of nihilism, that nature doesn't mean anything, built right into that next paragraph, when he talks about the way that the begriff, he doesn't use the word begriff, but he uses immediacy at the end of the paragraph, the way that a baby's begriff immerses it so completely in its experience of life that there is this astonishing complete fit of the infant to the world around it. The way that it reacts to everything makes it a weird paradox in that on the one hand, it's so helpless to plan for the future or control anything. But on the other hand, it's more aware of the world around it and within it than we will ever be again. As we engage in the Hegelian dialectic of developing ourselves into Verstand, we abstract ourselves out of Begriff, and our touch with what's going on around us and what's going on inside us gets more and more tenuous. And it's easy to forget that that's happening until you look into the face of an infant for whom everything is astonishing. You know, the way they just completely, you know, the eyes pop open, you know, the way they just totally fixate on one thing after another because everything is amazing. And he says, you know, to be able to do that, I mean, we focus on the helplessness of an infant, but we forget that the capacity to be so plugged into the world and into yourself that you effectively are part of it, right? Your emotion.
And that, Rick, that makes you just completely forget about how helpless they are, because they give you so much joy because of the way they give you in smiles and gurgles and that kind of, and it just, you just want to eat them up. They're so cute, you know.
And 2 a.m. feeds.
Well, we aren't really talking about the 2 a.m. feeds when we're talking about
and that's the way they feed you. That's the way they feed you.
Right.
You know, give you so much joy, so much joy. Yeah.
And they're reminding you what it felt like to be that connected to the world and that much a part of it. They have, when we focus on the helplessness, we forget that their being plugged into the world is not just an accident, but is an astonishing capacity that they have, an incredibly beautifully engineered capacity by evolution to be so sensitive, to be such a expression of the way that things are.
I had an experience when my baby was 1 month old. He was 1 month old. Yeah. We take him in to my pediatrician for 1 month old vaccination or something. And I'm holding this baby in my arms as I'm talking to the receptionist at the doctor's office. And I look down at him and I go, And then he responds to me like, and make this expression himself. And I go, and I shout out, I said, my baby just responded to me just now. He's only 1 month old, you know?
Yes.
And and from then on, just forever, never ending joy. Yeah.
I spent a few hours yesterday at my dad's birthday with my nephew, my sister's son, and he's only 1.25 years old right now. So he's at the point where he can toddle around, and everything's still amazing. Like, you know, every time he sees something, he points at it and goes, and he doesn't mean he's got a problem. He's like, oh my God, can you believe that? And just as you start to pay attention to it, he looks to his left and sees something else, goes, It's like, it's all so cool. And, you know, part of what Kenneth is getting at in here is that when we sophisticate ourselves through education and logic and reasoning, and we are developing one power at the expense of atrophying another. And the power that we're atrophying is not just interesting, and it's certainly not a primitive form of what we're developing. It's necessary to a complete life and a complete understanding of the world. And that it becomes then our mission at the point where we recognize it to reintroduce it to ourselves and create the third mentality through the marriage of the Verstand and the Begriff in the form of Vernunft. That the infant is making crystal clear that sense of wonder and perceptiveness, even without understanding, the perceptiveness, the raw, oh my goodness, what is that? Is something without which you can never have a fully formed human mind. When we get, like Hegel says, the familiar is, whatever is familiar is for that very reason not recognized for what it truly is. So that's the Verstand operating in us to abstract things and make them seem everyday and ordinary, when in fact they're still full of miracles that any infant could see and point to and go, and we have to be reminded It's part of what's handy about parenting is the reminder that all around us all the time are all of these really amazing things going on that we have become invisible to us. We push them into the background because of the first operation of foreground and background. And as a result, we start failing to recognize what's actually going on. And the child provokes us to take another look at everything over and over and go, oh, you're right. That dandelion actually is amazing. Blowing on a dandelion and having its seeds lift away and float into the sky is a miracle, you know? And the number of living cells working together it takes to develop those seeds and pull that off and create a new dandelion plant is frankly an act of magic. I mean, for all the science involved, it's a miracle that it works. We have never built a machine that can do that. And every dandelion in your backyard is doing it all the time. There is this potency to life that we have to be reminded of. And that an infant can do in a nutshell, because they're just like, oh, yeah, that's amazing. And you're like, it is? Oh, yeah, it is. Like we wake up again to a world that we've partly fallen asleep in.
So in the Bible, it seems to me there was, according to my memory, wasn't there two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life?
Yes.
And we put so much emphasis on the tree of knowledge. I mean,
yes,
we are forgotten about the tree of life that is also there. How
Yes.
come that is not emphasized? And I'm thinking, like, when you think about this sort of knowledge culture, in a sense, you know, writing first came out in Babylonia, no, not in Sumeria, right?
Mhm.
And it was about accounting. So that was the beginning, at least recorded history, of transactions, right? You owe me so much, I owe you this, you know what, you got to pay me this, whatever, that sort of thing. And I was going to go make that transition back to the transactional nature of human existence. And of course, the market culture has become so dominant now that everything is reduced to transaction. I want to illustrate a wonderful art project that's somebody that came to our school and talked about. So he's not a very famous artist, but it was a very interesting piece of art that most people probably wouldn't recognize as art. In Oakland, there was a kind of hole in the wall food place, a Vietnamese food place that apparently made just excellent food, but it was just sort of pretty much a takeout place, all right? So this guy decided he would open up a restaurant right across the street, the Vietnamese restaurant in Vietnamese called The Horse. He opened up a restaurant across the street called, in English, The Horse. Okay? And it was very fancy, decorated and everything. And people dressed up for the opening. It was a big she thing to do. The society people was there, artists and maybe regular people as well. And what they did was, and there was big windows on the front so you could see what the heck is happening in the streets and across the street. They would have a fancy way to take the order and all that. And then he would take it to the front desk, and then the front desk would have some pickup man go across the street and order this stuff right in the open. And then they would bring it back and dish it up in these fancy plates and all that, and serve it, and really charge extraordinary money.
Right.
So the market structure, the capitalism, has now been transformed even beyond the transaction of money. It's now gone into hyper capitalism, where you have to create what's called, I guess I would call it, surplus value, right? And the way you do surplus value is you mark up things that is beyond its price, you know, such as, for instance, everybody's going into branding now because, you know, it's pretty much the same thing, but you got the brand.
Yes.
And you pay the extra money for the brand, which is sort of the coating outside in the sense to like make it whatever.
Right.
And it was very interesting. Like, I don't know how long the restaurant lasted. I think actually the restaurant across the street, the hole in the wall, might have been a conspiracy with this because they didn't complain, right?
Right.
Because it also brought them business or whatever. That people realized that place is good. And so now I think we got to the point where they even pump up the price. It's no longer truly transactional even. It's, like I said, hyper capitalism in which you mark up. And now you get to a point where like people are willing to pay actually more money for the fake thing than the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, wow, these guys are really good in advertising and in terms of the markup potential of what something is.
Yes.
Because now this is beyond capitalism, that's what I'm saying. It's beyond transaction. It's transaction plus a surplus value that you're getting for this other stuff, like which is branding. I guess, there was a point when designers were designers, but designers are now consider themselves artists because they're able to create the image of surplus value. So I think we're at a funny stage in even capitalism that we have to pay attention to in relationship to this transactional nature, that somehow this tree of knowledge have brought to us this understanding that there is actually surplus value.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Most people would, I guess you could go into the thing, if you didn't recognize it was art, you would recognize it as really, oh, this is a fucking scam. Right? But if you recognize his art, what he's doing, he's uncovering. He was uncovering the hidden nature of this surplus value.
That's right.
You're paying for.
That's right. So I guess we're going to wrap up because next week we begin Soul, Spirit, and Ego. That's a longer essay. We won't get through it in a week.
Can I give a tribute to you first before we wrap up, Rick?
Oh, no.
As I so rudely interrupted.
Sure.
First of all, I want to tell you, I've been with you for a couple of weeks, a couple of months. And I want to tell you that coming from ground zero, I have learned a lot. Having said that, what that has allowed me to do, I'm listening to a series of tapes by a professor from Panama, and he's going through all the philosophers one by one. He started at the pre-Socratics, and I've had that for quite a while because it comes from the great courses, which I used to listen in my car when I was working. But I want to tell you, just this exposure has increased my appreciation. It's not there yet, tremendously. So I want to thank you for that.
You're most welcome.
I second that.
I'll second that. I'll third that.
Yeah, me too. Me too. As
Thank
I
you.
always do.
My sincere pleasure. My sincere pleasure. It's easy for me to do when we're working off of material as rich as Kenneth Smith's, because I'm really
and diverse.
Yes,
I forgot that because I remember I look back on my notes, and my first question, one of the first questions I asked is, why did you pick this series of essays? And your answer to me was, he's not committed to any particular ideology. And I went, oh, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And over time, I have begun to understand it. And it's that diversity of the ideology which gives you exposure to all these philosophers whose opinions change with time as they try to figure out the meaning. And that's been very instructional for me. I don't know as much as Donald, but I'm getting there, Donald. I'm going to catch up.
The first book that that I read of Kenneth's was Essays in Nihilism and Ideology,
first one,
where he takes up ideological thinking. Not just in terms of modernism, but examples from history of ideological thinking. It's circularity. It's cut off from the world because it needs ideological thinking. Generally, doesn't rely on evidence. It relies on a circular logical argument. I will mention some, I mean, I won't say this about Marx, but I'll say this about many Marxists, or at least modern Marxists, is that they are very ideological in their thinking. Evidence means nothing, you know, and they're other. We'll all say, oh yes, well, you must be talking about the Republicans. They've cut themselves off from evidence. Well, moderns across the board have cut themselves off. They just don't see where their thinking has detached from the world.
Right.
You know, I'm sure in certain thoughts I am. I do the same thing, you know, particularly when I worked. You know, that was a purely banal, it was money for work product and purely transactional whatever. And it was, how do you just perform that? And I'll have to say, the sentence in here that I think Dave, what was the one with the wisdom, you know, the wisdom of the douloi there, the slave, you know, that describes something that so many of us, I mean,
we're drawn into it.
You're drawn into it. It's the quickest and easiest way to make a living in this, and you just try and minimize its impact on you personally, you know.
Can I say this though, Donald? That's one of the areas from which I'm very, very grateful for, because I became a doctor when I was about 22, 23 years old. And you all immediately, you saw the meaning of life in front of you. It was life, it was death, it was suffering, it was decision. And so I never really had to deal with that transactional part of it until I did corporate medicine for a while. So I got to understand both sides of the fence. And I did go to business school, and I was going to make the transition to corporate medicine, and I changed my mind. It was too uncomfortable. I went back.
Yeah.
I would say, Sharon, that in my own career, never had to address anything like that. But like many bonosoi, you know, I worked hard and I saved my money. I lived beneath my means in an effort to cut myself, get out of slavery.
That's the secret.
And saved and whatever. And the last 10 years of my career, I did the best work I ever did, because I actually had FU money, you know, the sort of, oh, you know, I don't need the job, but it is pleasant to do if I'm allowed to do it the way I want to do it.
Right.
So I was in the mode, I was a computer programmer. I was very skilled at that, but only at certain times would you get a problem, and I was a great problem solver, another Banosic trait, because I can think like a computer. I can scope my mind down, stop that wandering around, and
you reverse stunt.
I can become very much literal minded, obsessive compulsive, but I was able to say, look, we're going to look for the real root cause, or I'm going to go home. You know, we are going to solve this problem correctly. We are going to address what has really gone wrong. and that was okay, but that was only because I no longer needed the paycheck.
Right.
And that for a modern, I thought was about as good as it got. I mean,
yes,
I didn't have someone else actively supporting me, you know, but I had to manage to somewhat free myself.
That's where the joy is. Did you find the joy?
I had a hard time. If it hadn't have been for COVID and my coworkers choosing to work from home, I would probably still be working, because
right.
The problems were intellectually interesting. They were very complex, and the people I worked with were amazing.
Right.
You know, and I got to enjoy it, you know,
right.
after a few decades of, you know, dealing with crap and BS and obstruction. When it finally became clear, even to my management, this guy only is going to do it this one way because he doesn't need this job. He really can live without it.
That's when it became a pleasure.
Then it became a pleasure, a real pleasure.
Well, Rick, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I had to give you my tribute. So next week.
Thank you, Rick.
So next
You're
week
welcome.
we're doing the 7, right? It's a long essay, all of it, or how many parts of it?
We'll just start at the beginning, and we'll
Okay.
see how long it takes us to get through it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. And
Thank you very
David.
much. And thank you guys for being great. Thank you.
You're
a
great.
Thank you, David, for giving me the link. They were well. I don't know where he is, but thank you, David. Okay, bye, Rick.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
and
you.
I can't imagine, Rick, how you came to absorb so much of Kenneth. And you don't seem to be suffering.
No, he helped me understand this essay because I didn't get it at all. I just didn't get it.
You know, this is. I have spent, not recently, but particularly for the first 20 years or so when I was out of school, I saw Kenneth very regularly. And we had long conversations in which he talked and I tried to listen. I mean, this is difficult.
Yeah.
I've become more used to it over time, but there's a great extent to where, you know, I mean, I went through school. I studied Greek. I studied German. I read a lot of this stuff in those languages, plus with Kenneth and stuff. And I just don't know how I wouldn't start today reading this. You know, I mean, and
I feel pretty good. I give kudos to myself. But
You're doing well.
You're doing you guys.
You're doing well.
And I got this. I had none of that. I never had a philosophy class my whole life. You know.
Well,
and I'm catching on.
There is very little in a philosophy class that would help you understand Kenneth Smith.
It's true.
And you can read his own critiques of the faculty at LSU. He's talked about the faculty at the place in Dallas, the Catholic school where he taught there. He seldom comes back and says, "Boy, I am working with world-class people." He says, "You won't believe the idiotism that among people who are supposed to, they look at philosophy as a job. They present series of lectures. They are not there, as the Greek said, you know, philosophy is born in wonder, a wonder of how the world works, what we are to do, what is our nature." I mean, they're there. I don't know. I wouldn't say that I had many inspiring teachers, but some of them did force me to do things, you know. One, I had to study math. You know, I had to study German and Greek because it was imagined that I would go further than I did. I was a great disappointment because
I've been meaning to talk to you about that, Donald.
Well, no, they did. They got me into graduate school at a very good graduate school. And once I began to see that these men were not interested in living a philosophical life.
Right.
They were interested in pursuing the technical aspects of some philosopher that they specialized in, or in largely lecturing on the history of philosophy, not on how do you live philosophically.
Right.
That's never comes up. And then I realized, I thought I actually left. I took a job as a carpenter, which did real things. You know, I'm pretty pleased with it for a while. But yeah, Kenneth, there is no other. Well, there's just no other person. I mean, I've had that. Sharon.
Yes.
There is since you bring up the learning company or the teaching company or whatever it is.
The great courses.
The great courses, yes. I have lots of them. There is an old thing by David Robinson. He's a British guy who did like 125 lectures on the history of philosophy for the great courses. I don't know if the course is still available, but I watched it. Some guy in the next cube says, "Oh, you studied philosophy? Well, I watched this course on philosophy." And I said, "God, that can't be good." You know, I have no idea what you got. But one, David Robinson is not a philosopher. He is a professor emeritus of psychology. He took this up because of his own passion for it, and actually delivers, within my limited knowledge, fair presentations of the history of philosophy.
Well, the one I'm watching,
I'm sorry.
The one I'm watching is called Philosophy as a Guide to Living, and it's done by a professor from Sonoma University. I like his style. It's very simple, and he weaves a path through history. He talks about it on a timeline, which is digestible for me. So that's the one I'm doing. But I've followed great courses the whole time. I like that group. And when I didn't have the time, and all I had to do was plug a DVD in the car, it certainly, I don't want to say broke the monotony of medicine, but it gave me something else to focus on. Right. Which was my curiosity. It satisfied my curiosity. And if anybody else does great courses, like great courses, you've done it. Joseph's done it. Yes.
Yeah, I have a lot of them on Greek mythology, Greek history, the history of the Persian Wars, the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, all things in an effort to build the context necessary to read this Smith guy.
Yes. Yes.
On it, Donald. I'm working on it.
I mean, it's really, Rick has pointed this out. I am not adding anything here, but it is harder to read Kenneth if you haven't read Thucydides. And I would add Herodotus, Xenophon, lots of things.
Belshazzar's feast. Where did that come from?
Well, I had to look that up. If I have a deficiency, it's in my Old Testament.
Yes.
You know.
I had to look that up too. All right. Well, let's not keep Rick any longer. Thank you for listening, Rick.
My
Is that
pleasure.
your cat's tail?
Yes, this is Surya. Let's see if we can bring her into focus.
Hi, Surya.
Wow.
Oh, she's the one with the bronchopulmonary dysplasia, the BPD, with the respiratory problem.
Yes, yes, but the new medicine seems to be working. She stopped coughing.
And she stopped
good.
wheezing. Yes,
So-
which is good. Yeah.
Yeah, very
All right.
helpful.
How old is she?
She's 14.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's an old age disease.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but maybe she's got some more years in her now that she's recovering from this. So looks like it was a
All right.
fungal infection.
Okay.
Well, Sharon,
Yes.
every week I come to this and say, I'm not going to talk. And then somebody says something and I find myself furiously writing things down, saying, oh, that relates to this and to that and to whatever. You know, go read.
I never say that. I talk all the time.
Go read.
I'm glad I'm happy all of you talk because I like listening to you.
Well, if you kind of want to get an idea, I think for kind of Kenneth's view is like read the Glass Bead Game or Magister Ludi, Hermann Hesse, where they actually have this contest among these people to see if they can just link together all of human society ever, you know, into this giant web. And you start realizing, oh, I know somebody who's really trying to do that.
Right.
Yeah. I want to say something in support of Donald. Philosophy has degenerated into a history of philosophy.
Yeah.
And I'll say this about art because the metaphor is better and it's something I know about. I've studied with many art historians and some of them are good, but most of them are not so good. And every time I walk into a room, look at art history, I say, oh yes, art in the dark.
I got that. Art in the dark.
Yes.
Do you guys have mangoes on the West Coast?
They don't grow here, but they get shipped here, so we get to try them.
Oh, well, I have 2 giant trees in my backyard and they're just starting to ripen.
Oh, really?
Wonderful.
Yes.
That is awesome.
Yes.
I think California is able to have them, but a lot of them are shipped from Mexico.
Okay.
Oh, the thing that's
All right.
coming into season here is cherries. They're just starting now.
Oh, that's delicious. I like that too. That's very, very good. All right, guys. See you all next week.
See you next
And
week.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, guys.